Before we descend into the darkness, I want to ask a favour. If you enjoy this story, please use your hype points on this video. It helps the channel more than you possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes a massive difference. And if you'd like, comment what time it is and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content, consider subscribing. Now let's begin. Probability shapes the way we move through the world, quietly guiding countless everyday decisions. When you check the weather forecast and see a 95% chance of sunshine, you probably leave your umbrella at home. When you buckle your seatbelt, you're not expecting an accident. The probability of one on any given trip is vanishingly small. We live comfortably with these probabilities, treating events that are extremely unlikely as if they simply won't happen. This mental shortcut serves us well most of the time. It would be exhausting to maintain constant awareness of every remote possibility, so we round things off. We take what is highly probable, and for practical purposes, treat it as certain. This habit feels not just convenient but reasonable. After all, if something has a 99.999% chance of happening, isn't it essentially guaranteed? And if something has that same percentage chance of not happening, isn't it essentially ruled out? In daily life, the difference between almost certain and certain rarely matters. You plan your day around high probabilities and, most of the time, things work out roughly as expected. The weather is usually close to what was forecast. The bridge you drive over doesn't collapse. The restaurant you visit doesn't give you food poisoning. These aren't certainties, but they're close enough that you'd feel silly worrying about them. Yet there's a curious puzzle lurking in this everyday reasoning, one that emerges when you push this habit just a bit further. It's called the lottery paradox, and it reveals something subtle and fascinating about how probability and belief interact. The paradox doesn't involve any exotic physics or abstract mathematics. It starts with something utterly mundane. A lottery. Not a real lottery necessarily, but the kind of simple, fair lottery you might imagine for the sake of a thought experiment. And from this simple starting point, it leads to a genuinely perplexing conclusion about what it means to believe something rationally. The charm of the lottery paradox is that it sneaks up on you. It doesn't announce itself with flashing lights or dramatic contradictions. Instead, it emerges gradually, step by step, each step seeming perfectly sensible on its own. You begin with a situation everyone can understand. You make a series of judgments that each feel entirely reasonable, and then suddenly you realize those judgments have led you somewhere impossible. The paradox doesn't tell you that you've made a mistake. It just quietly points out that something has gone wrong, and it invites you to figure out what. So let's begin where the paradox begins, with a perfectly ordinary lottery. Imagine a lottery with a very large number of tickets. To make things concrete, let's say there are 1 million tickets. Each ticket has a unique number, from 1 to 1 million. The lottery is completely fair. That means every ticket has exactly the same chance of winning. There are no tricks, no biases, no hidden patterns. The winning ticket will be selected by some genuinely random process. Maybe a computer generates a random number, or maybe numbered balls are drawn from a tumbler. The details don't matter. What matters is that the process is fair, and everyone agrees it's fair. In this lottery, exactly one ticket will win. That's guaranteed. It's part of the setup. When the lottery is over, one ticket will be the winner, and all the other tickets will be losers. This isn't a probability, it's a certainty. The lottery's rules ensure that there must be a winner. So we know with complete confidence that when the dust settles, 999,999 tickets will have lost, and one ticket will have won. Now consider any particular ticket in this lottery. Let's start with ticket number 1. What's the probability that ticket number 1 will win? Since the lottery is fair and there are 1 million tickets total, the probability is 1 in 1 million. That's a very small probability. It's 0.0001%. If you held ticket number 1, you would not expect to win. You might hope to win, certainly, but you wouldn't expect it. The odds are overwhelmingly against you. Turn this around and consider the probability that ticket number 1 will lose. That probability is 999,999 out of 1 million. In other words, 99.9999%. This is an extremely high probability. If you were betting on whether ticket number 1 would lose, you'd be making a very safe bet. The chance of being wrong is 1 in a million. Here's where things start to get interesting. Suppose someone asks you, "Do you believe ticket number 1 will lose?" How should you answer? Well, given the probabilities, it seems entirely reasonable to say yes. You believe ticket number 1 will lose. After all, it almost certainly will lose. The probability is so close to 100% that the difference barely seems worth mentioning. For any practical purpose, you can treat it as a foregone conclusion. Ticket number 1 will lose. This isn't a wild guess or a superstitious hunch. It's a rational judgment based on solid probabilistic reasoning. If you were making decisions based on this belief, if you were, say, deciding whether to plan a celebration party for the holder of ticket number 1, you would be entirely justified in not bothering. The ticket will lose. You believe it will lose. That belief seems not just permissible, but appropriate. Now consider ticket number 2. The exact same reasoning applies. Ticket number 2 has a 1 in 1 million chance of winning, which means it has a 99.9999% chance of losing. So it seems just as reasonable to believe that ticket number 2 will lose. And ticket number 3, same story. Ticket number 4, also the same. In fact, for any ticket you pick, the reasoning is identical. Each ticket has a minuscule chance of winning and an overwhelming chance of losing. For each individual ticket, believing it will lose seems like the rational thing to do. You can imagine going through the tickets one by one. Ticket number 1 will lose. Ticket number 2 will lose. Ticket number 3 will lose. You continue through the hundreds, the thousands, the hundreds of thousands. Each time the judgment feels solid. Each ticket, considered on its own, almost certainly will not win. So for each ticket, it's rational to believe it will lose. The reasoning is repetitive, but it's also consistent. There's no point at which you switch methods or apply different standards. Every ticket gets the same treatment, and every ticket gets the same verdict. But now a problem appears. If you believe ticket number 1 will lose, and you believe ticket number 2 will lose, and you believe ticket number 3 will lose, and you continue this all the way through ticket number 1 million, then you believe something very specific about each ticket. And when you put all these beliefs together, they seem to add up to a collective belief. You believe that all the tickets will lose. This is where the paradox bites. You can't rationally believe that all the tickets will lose, because that's not just improbable, it's impossible. The lottery guarantees that one ticket will win. So the collective belief that all tickets will lose contradicts a known fact. It's not merely false, it's necessarily false. Yet this impossible belief appears to follow directly from a series of individually reasonable beliefs. Each step felt justified. Each individual judgment seemed rational. But the end point is absurd. This is the lottery paradox in its purest form. You start with beliefs that each seem perfectly rational. You combine them in a straightforward way, and you end up with a conclusion that cannot possibly be true. Something has gone wrong, but it's not immediately obvious what. Each individual belief seems fine. The method of reasoning seems fine, yet the result is clearly broken. At first glance, you might think the problem is obvious and easily fixed. Maybe you just shouldn't believe that every ticket will lose. Maybe the solution is to remain agnostic about the collective outcome. But that doesn't quite resolve the tension, because the question isn't really about the collective outcome. It's about the individual tickets. The paradox asks, is it rational to believe, of ticket number 1 specifically, that it will lose? And if the answer is yes, then why isn't it also rational to believe the same thing about ticket number 2? And ticket number 3, the paradox forces you to either accept the absurd conclusion or reject one of the seemingly reasonable steps that led to it. To understand why this is genuinely puzzling, it helps to think about what we usually expect from rational belief. In everyday reasoning, we tend to assume that rational beliefs should fit together in a logically coherent way. If you rationally believe that it's raining, and you rationally believe that you forgot your umbrella, then it seems you should also rationally believe the combination. It's raining, and you forgot your umbrella. This principle is sometimes called closure under conjunction. It says that if you believe A and you believe B, then you should believe A and B together. This principle seems almost too obvious to state. It's hard to imagine a conception of rational belief that doesn't respect it. After all, if you genuinely believe two things, why wouldn't you believe them together? Denying closure would seem to allow a strange kind of compartmentalized thinking, where you could hold beliefs that you simultaneously acknowledge don't fit together. That seems irrational, or at least very odd. The lottery paradox puts pressure on this principle. It suggests that you can have many individual beliefs, each one highly rational, that you nonetheless should not combine into a single joint belief. You can rationally believe that ticket 1 will lose, and rationally believe that ticket 2 will lose, and so on, without rationally believing that all tickets will lose. This means that rational belief, in the context of probabilistic reasoning, might not be closed under conjunction. You can believe each part without believing the whole. This is a surprising and somewhat uncomfortable conclusion. It challenges a deeply intuitive idea about how beliefs should work. But before accepting it, it's worth exploring why the individual beliefs seemed rational in the first place. What exactly are we doing when we say we believe that ticket number 1 will lose? One way to think about it is that we're making a judgment based on very high probability. We're not claiming absolute certainty. We're not saying it's metaphysically impossible for ticket 1 to win. We're just saying it's so unlikely that we're willing to treat it as a settled matter. In ordinary language, we'd say we believe it will lose. But what does that word believe really mean in this context? This is where the paradox starts to reveal something important. In everyday speech, believe is a bit of a blunt instrument. We use it to cover a wide range of confidence levels. Sometimes we believe things with rock-solid certainty, mathematical truths, for instance, or the fact that we exist. Other times, we believe things with high confidence, but not absolute certainty. The sun will rise tomorrow, the grocery store will be open at its usual time. And sometimes we believe things with less confidence still, that it probably won't rain today, that the traffic won't be too bad. In all these cases, we use the same word, believe. The lottery paradox exploits this blurriness. It takes a case where believe is being used in the high confidence but not certainty sense, and asks what happens when you scale it up. If you're 99.9999% confident that ticket 1 will lose, is that enough to count as belief? Most people would say yes. That's about as confident as you can be about anything in the real world. But then, if you're equally confident about every single ticket, the paradox asks, does that mean you believe the conjunction of all those statements? And if you do, you've just committed yourself to believing something impossible. The problem is that high probability and certainty are not the same thing, even when the probability is very, very high. Certainty has a special property. If you're certain of A and certain of B, then you're certain of A and B together. Certainty is perfectly preserved under conjunction. But probability doesn't work that way. If you're 99% confident of A and 99% confident of B, you're not necessarily 99% confident of A and B together. In fact, as you combine more and more independent high probability statements, the probability that they're all true drops. Consider the ish lottery tickets again. The probability that ticket 1 loses is 0.999999. The probability that ticket 2 loses is also 0.999999. But the probability that both ticket 1 and ticket 2 lose is not 0.9, 99999, it's 0.99999 multiplied by 0.99999, which is slightly less. When you extend this to all 1 million tickets, the probability that all of them lose is not 0.99999. It's 0.999999 raised to the power of 1 million. And that number is essentially zero. In fact, it's not just close to zero, it is zero because we know one ticket must win. This calculation reveals the heart of the paradox. Each individual belief has an extremely high probability of being true, but the probability that all the beliefs are true together is not high, it's zero. So if you're treating I believe X as meaning X has a very high probability, then each individual belief statement seems justified. But if you're also assuming that believing each of A, B, C, and so on means you should believe A and B and C, and so on, then you're in trouble. Those two principles collide in the lottery case. So what should you do? One option is to reject the idea that rational belief is closed under conjunction. You could say that it's perfectly fine to believe each individual statement without believing their conjunction, as long as the individual statements are based on high probability. This might feel strange at first, but it has some intuitive support. After all, you know going into the lottery that exactly one ticket will win. You're not surprised when a ticket wins. You just don't know which one. So maybe it's reasonable to maintain a kind of distributed confidence, high confidence about each individual ticket losing, combined with an acknowledgement that the collective belief would be false. This approach has a certain elegance. It respects the probabilistic reasoning that made each individual belief seem rational, and it avoids the absurd conclusion by denying that those beliefs need to combine in the usual logical way. Rational belief on this view is more flexible than pure logic. It can tolerate a kind of structured inconsistency, where you hold many beliefs that you know can't all be true together, as long as each one is individually well supported. But this approach also has costs. It means giving up on a very natural principle about how beliefs should cohere. It means accepting that a rational person might in some sense believe contradictory things, not in the sense of believing both P and not P, but in the sense of believing a set of things that logically entail something they know to be false. That's a departure from traditional ideas about rationality, and some people find it unsettling. Another option is to raise the bar for what counts as belief. Maybe you shouldn't call it a belief unless the probability is even higher than 99.9999%. Maybe you need something closer to absolute certainty before you're entitled to use the word believe. On this view, the mistake in the lottery case is saying you believe each ticket will lose. You don't believe it. You just think it's very likely. Belief requires a higher standard, one that's safe under conjunction. This approach preserves the closure principle, but at a cost. It makes belief very demanding. In a million-ticket lottery, you can't believe any individual ticket will lose, because the probability, while very high, isn't high enough. In fact, on this view, you might not be able to believe much of anything about the real world, because very few things are certain enough to meet the standard. This seems overly restrictive. It doesn't match how people actually use the word believe, and it would make everyday reasoning extremely cumbersome. A third option is to say that what counts as rational belief depends on context. Maybe in some contexts, a 99.9999% probability is enough to justify belief, and in other contexts it isn't. The context might include things like what's at stake, how many beliefs you're aggregating, and what you're going to do with those beliefs. In a low-stakes context where you're reasoning about a single ticket, maybe it's fine to believe it will lose. In a higher-stakes context where you're reasoning about all the tickets together, maybe you need to be more careful. This contextualist approach has some appeal. It captures the intuition that rationality isn't one-size-fits-all, and it allows for flexibility in how we apply the concept of belief. But it also introduces complexity. It means there's no simple answer to the question, do you believe ticket 1 will lose? The answer depends on what you're doing with that belief, and how it fits into your broader reasoning. This might be realistic, but it also makes the paradox harder to resolve cleanly. A fourth option, related to the third, is to distinguish between different kinds of mental states. Maybe there's a difference between believing something and merely accepting it for practical purposes. When you say, ticket 1 will lose, maybe you're not expressing a full-fledged belief. You're just accepting the statement as a working assumption, something you're willing to act on in most contexts. Acceptance is more provisional, more context-sensitive, and more pragmatic than belief. And importantly, acceptance doesn't need to be closed under conjunction. You can accept each of many statements individually without accepting their conjunction. This distinction has some philosophical precedent. It allows you to make sense of how scientists often work, for instance. A scientist might accept a theory for research purposes without fully believing it's true. They use it as a framework, a tool, something to work with, but they remain open to revising it, and they don't commit to it in the same deep way they might commit to, say, the belief that they exist. In the lottery case, you might accept that ticket 1 will lose, accept that ticket 2 will lose, and so on, without accepting that all tickets will lose. This avoids the paradox while preserving something close to the original intuition. Each of these responses has strengths and weaknesses, and philosophers continue to debate which, if any, is the right way to think about the lottery paradox. What's remarkable is that such a simple setup can generate such deep and persistent disagreement. The lottery isn't a complicated scenario. The probabilities aren't hard to calculate. Yet the question of how to think about belief in this context remains genuinely open. Part of what makes the paradox so durable is that it touches on something fundamental about how human minds handle uncertainty. We don't experience probabilities directly. We experience something more like degrees of confidence. When you think about ticket 1, you feel very confident it will lose. That feeling of confidence is what prompts you to say you believe it will lose. But feelings of confidence don't automatically track the subtleties of probabilistic reasoning. Your mind doesn't naturally compute the joint probability of a million independent events. It just takes each event one at a time and registers high confidence about each one. This is efficient in a way. It would be cognitively overwhelming to constantly track the interactions between all your probabilistic beliefs. So your mind uses shortcuts. It treats high confidence as if it were certainty, because in most everyday contexts that's close enough. You don't need to worry about the 1 in a million chance that your chair will collapse when you sit down, or that the water you drink is actually poison, or that the sun won't rise tomorrow. These things are possible in principle, but their probabilities are so low that you can safely ignore them. The lottery paradox reveals the limit of this shortcut. It constructs a scenario where you're forced to apply the shortcut many times in a row, and where the cumulative effect makes the shortcut break down. Each individual application seems fine. Each ticket, considered alone, really is overwhelmingly likely to lose. But when you aggregate a million such judgments, the approximation fails. The thing you were treating as certain turns out not to be certain after all, and the difference matters. In a sense, the paradox is a reminder that probability and certainty are different in kind, not just in degree. A 99% probability is not just a little bit less than certainty. It's a fundamentally different thing. And a 99.9999% probability, while much closer to certainty, is still not the same. As long as there's any gap at all, that gap can be exploited by scaling things up. The lottery paradox is the result of that exploitation. This has implications beyond lotteries. Think about large, complex systems made up of many components. Suppose you're managing a system with 1 million parts, and each part has a 99.9999% or a reliability rate. For any individual part, it's very reasonable to believe it will function correctly. But should you believe all million parts will function correctly at the same time? The math says no. Even though each part is highly reliable, the chance that all of them work perfectly is vanishingly small. In fact, with 1 million parts each having a 1 in a million failure rate, you'd expect about 1 failure on average. You don't know which part will fail, just as you don't know which lottery ticket will win, but you can be confident something will go wrong somewhere. This is why engineers build redundancy into complex systems. They don't treat high reliability as if it was certainty. They account for the fact that when you have enough components, even unlikely failures become likely at the system level. The lottery paradox captures the same insight in a purer form. It's not about practical engineering, it's about the logical structure of belief and probability, but the lesson translates. You can also see the paradox at work in other kinds of large-scale reasoning. Consider a weather forecaster who makes predictions for 1,000 different days. For each individual day, they might be 99% confident in their prediction. But should they be 99% confident that all 1,000 predictions will be correct? Clearly not. Even with high accuracy, 10 wrong predictions would be expected. The forecaster knows this. They don't believe all their predictions will be right, but for each individual prediction, they might well believe it will be right, because the probability is high enough. The structure is the same as the lottery, or consider a medical test that's 99.9% accurate. If you test negative, it's very reasonable to believe you don't have the disease. But if 1 million people are tested, and each person believes their own result, then collectively, they're believing things that can't all be true. About 1,000 people will get false results. The reasoning about individual cases seems solid, but the aggregate reasoning breaks down. These examples show that the lottery paradox isn't just an abstract puzzle. It reflects a real tension in how we think about uncertainty in the world. We make confident judgments about individual cases based on high probabilities. We often have to, because perfect certainty is rarely available. But when we're dealing with many cases, those confident judgments can lead us astray if we're not careful. The paradox is a warning about the limits of treating high probability as if it was certainty. What's comforting in a way is that the paradox doesn't imply that rationality itself is broken. It doesn't show that rational thinking is impossible, or that we should give up on making probabilistic judgments. Instead, it shows that we need to be thoughtful about how we use language like believe in probabilistic contexts. It shows that rational thinking involves more than just logic. It also involves calibration, being aware of how confidence scales, how probabilities combine, and when the shortcuts we usually rely on might fail. The paradox also highlights the limits of ordinary language. Words like believe, know, and certain evolved for everyday communication, not for precise reasoning about probability. They're fuzzy at the edges. They don't map cleanly onto mathematical concepts like probability and certainty. The lottery paradox lives in that fuzziness. It's a case where our ordinary way of talking about belief leads to something that sounds contradictory, even though the underlying probabilities are perfectly clear and consistent. In that sense, the paradox is less about belief itself and more about how we talk about belief. It's a semantic puzzle as much as a logical one. The probabilities are straightforward. The logic is straightforward. The confusion arises when we try to describe the situation using everyday language, and we find that the language doesn't quite fit. We say we believe ticket 1 will lose, and that seems right. We say we believe ticket 2 will lose, and that also seems right. But we can't say we believe all tickets will lose, and that creates a mismatch. The language of belief doesn't scale in the way we'd expect. One way to resolve this is to be more precise in how we talk. Instead of saying, I believe ticket 1 will lose, you could say, I assign a 99.9999% probability to ticket 1 losing. That's more cumbersome, but it's also more accurate, and importantly, it doesn't trigger the same paradox. You can assign a 99.9999% probability to ticket 1 losing, and another 99.9999% probability to ticket 2 losing, and so on, without any contradiction. The probabilities don't need to be closed under conjunction. in the same way beliefs seem to be. You can have a 99.9999% confidence in each individual event while having a 0% confidence in all of them happening together, and that's perfectly coherent. But this solution, while technically correct, doesn't quite capture how people actually think. Most people don't walk around assigning numerical probabilities to everything. They have beliefs, hunches, expectations, and degrees of confidence, but these are usually qualitative rather than quantitative. The language of belief is natural and intuitive, even if it's not always precise. The challenge is to understand how that natural language relates to the more precise language of probability and where the translation breaks down. The lottery paradox is a useful tool for exploring that relationship. It's a clean, simple case where the breakdown is obvious. It forces you to confront the gap between I believe this and this has a very high probability. It makes you think about whether those two things are the same, and if not, how they differ. And it invites you to consider how rational belief should be understood in a world where certainty is rare and probability is everywhere. There's something almost meditative about thinking through the paradox slowly. You start with a situation that feels completely ordinary. A lottery with tickets, with one winner, nothing exotic, nothing hard to imagine. And then you follow the reasoning, step by step, carefully. Each step is small, each step makes sense. And then at the end, you arrive somewhere strange. The strangeness isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, subtle, almost gentle. It's just the realization that something you thought was simple is actually a bit more complicated than you expected. This kind of realization is part of what makes philosophy engaging. It's not about finding definitive answers. It's about noticing things, questioning assumptions, and appreciating the complexity that hides beneath the surface of everyday reasoning. The lottery paradox does this beautifully. It takes a mundane scenario and uses it to reveal something deep about belief, probability, and rationality. It doesn't tell you what to think. It just shows you that the question is harder than it first appeared. And that's okay. In fact, it's better than okay. It's part of how understanding deepens. You start with a simple picture of how things work. You notice a problem with that picture. You explore different ways to fix the problem, each with its own trade-offs. You don't necessarily arrive at a final answer, but you end up with a richer, more nuanced understanding of the terrain. The paradox is a guide on that journey. As you lie here, thinking about tickets and probabilities, there's a certain calm that comes from recognizing the limits of certainty. The world is full of uncertainty. Most things are probable rather than certain. We navigate that uncertainty with mental shortcuts, rough and ready heuristics, and a willingness to round off the rough edges. Most of the time, that works fine. But every now and then, a paradox like this one reminds us that the shortcuts aren't perfect. They have limits. And understanding those limits is part of being a careful thinker. The lottery paradox doesn't demand that you fix everything right now. It doesn't insist that you choose one solution over another. It just asks you to notice the problem, to sit with it, to think about it. And in that sitting and thinking, there's a kind of quiet satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of solving a puzzle completely, but the satisfaction of seeing the puzzle clearly, of understanding its shape and structure, of appreciating why it's interesting. There's also something reassuring about the fact that the paradox has been around for a long time and smart people still disagree about how to resolve it. It means you're not expected to have all the answers. It means the questions are genuinely difficult, and thinking about them carefully is a worthwhile activity in itself. You're not failing if you don't arrive at a definitive conclusion. You're engaging with a deep issue, turning it over in your mind, exploring its facets. The paradox invites patience. It's not the kind of problem you solve quickly. It's the kind of problem you think about over time, returning to it occasionally, seeing it from different angles. Each time you return, you might notice something new, a new implication, a new connection, a new way of thinking about it. the paradox becomes familiar, but it doesn't become boring. It remains interesting because it touches on fundamental questions that don't have easy answers. In the quiet of the moment, with your mind turning over these ideas gently, you can appreciate the paradox for what it is. A beautiful example of how simple assumptions can lead to complex conclusions. It's a reminder that rationality is subtle, that language is imperfect, and that probability is both powerful and tricky. It's a small window into the larger project of understanding how minds work, how beliefs form, and how we make sense of a world that rarely offers certainty. And as your thoughts begin to drift, as the details of tickets and probabilities start to blur into the background, what remains is a sense of intellectual tranquility. The paradox isn't something to be anxious about. It's something to contemplate, to explore, to appreciate. It's a gentle puzzle, a quiet mystery, a small corner of the vast landscape of human thought. And there's something deeply restful about that, about engaging with ideas not because you have to solve them immediately, but because they're worth thinking about, because they reveal something about the world and about the mind's encounter with the world. The lottery paradox, in the end, is a paradox about humility. It's about recognizing that even our most confident beliefs might not fit together in the ways we expect. It's about accepting that almost certain and certain are genuinely different, even when the difference seems vanishingly small. It's about understanding that rational thinking isn't just about following rules. Mechanically, it's about being sensitive to context, to scale, to the ways in which many small probabilities can add up to something surprising. This humility doesn't mean giving up on confidence or retreating into skepticism. It just means being aware of the structure of your beliefs, of how they relate to probabilities, of when it's safe to combine them and when it's not. It means appreciating that rationality is a skill, not a formula, and that part of that skill is knowing when your usual shortcuts might lead you astray. In the context of the lottery, this means being comfortable with a certain kind of cognitive tension. You can believe, in a practical sense, that ticket one will lose. You can act on that belief, plan around it, use it to guide your decisions. But at the same time, you can hold lightly to the idea that this belief, when multiplied across all tickets, doesn't create a larger belief that all tickets will lose. You can maintain both the individual confidence and the collective uncertainty. It's a subtle balancing act, but it's one that reflects the reality of probabilistic reasoning. This balancing act is something we do all the time, often without noticing. When you drive to work, you believe you'll arrive safely, even though you know that car accidents happen. When you cook dinner, you believe the food won't make you sick, even though you know that food poisoning is possible. When you check your email, you believe it won't contain a catastrophic virus, even though you know that such things exist. In each case, you're holding a high probability belief, while implicitly acknowledging that the probability isn't 100%. The lottery paradox just makes this dynamic explicit and shows what happens when you scale it up. By making it explicit, the paradox gives you a chance to think about it more carefully, to understand the mechanisms at work, to see how probability shapes belief. And that understanding, even if it doesn't lead to a neat resolution, is valuable. It makes you a more thoughtful reasoner. It helps you avoid certain kinds of mistakes. It gives you a framework for thinking about other cases where high probabilities and large numbers interact in surprising ways. As the ideas continue to settle, there's a kind of beauty in the paradox's simplicity. It doesn't require advanced mathematics or specialized knowledge. It just requires clear thinking and a willingness to follow the logic wherever it leads. The setup is a lottery. The reasoning is basic probability. The conclusion is a gentle contradiction. And from that simple structure emerges a rich philosophical problem that has occupied some of the best minds in epistemology and decision theory. The paradox also connects to broader themes about how we live with uncertainty. Life doesn't offer many guarantees. Most of what we believe is based on incomplete information, probabilistic evidence, educated guesses. We make the best judgments we can with the information we have, and we move forward. The lottery paradox suggests that this is not just a practical necessity, but also a conceptual challenge. Even in ideal cases where the probabilities are clear and the logic is clean, there are still puzzles about how belief and probability fit together. This isn't cause for despair. It's just the nature of the territory. Uncertainty is woven into the fabric of the world, and our minds have evolved to navigate that uncertainty with remarkable skill. We're not perfect probabilistic reasoners, far from it, but we're good enough. We get by. We make predictions, form beliefs, take actions, and most of the time, things work out reasonably well. The lottery paradox is a reminder that even our best reasoning has limits, but it's also a testament to the fact that we can think carefully about those limits and understand them. In the stillness of contemplation, the paradox becomes less like a problem to be solved and more like a landscape to be explored. You can wander through its implications, considering different perspectives, trying out different responses, seeing what feels right and what doesn't. There's no rush, there's no pressure. It's an intellectual exercise, a form of mental leisure, a way of engaging with ideas for their own sake. And there's something deeply restful about that kind of engagement. It's not goal-oriented, it's not competitive. It's just you and an idea, turning it over, examining it, appreciating its nuances. The paradox doesn't judge you. It doesn't demand anything from you. It just offers itself up for consideration, and you can take from it what you will. As your mind begins to quiet, as the thoughts become slower and softer, the paradox fades into the background, leaving behind a residue of insight. You understand a little more about probability, about belief, about the gap between the two. You've travelled through a landscape of ideas, encountering familiar concepts in an unfamiliar context, and you've emerged with a slightly different perspective. That's the gift of a good paradox. It changes how you see things, gently and without fanfare. The lottery paradox will still be there tomorrow, and the day after that, and years from now. It's not going anywhere. Philosophers will continue to debate it, propose solutions, refine their theories, and you, if you wish, can return to it whenever you like, bringing new thoughts and new questions. It's a durable puzzle, one that rewards repeated engagement. But for now, in this moment, it's enough to have spent time with it, to have followed its reasoning, to have appreciated its elegance. The lottery tickets, with their precise probabilities and their stubborn refusal to all lose at once, have done their work. They've illustrated something subtle about how confidence and certainty differ, about how individual judgments and collective judgments can come apart, about how rational thinking navigates the space between the probable and the certain. And in that illustration, there's a kind of peace, the peace of understanding, however partial, the peace of engaging with difficult questions without needing immediate answers, the peace of recognizing that the world is complex, that our tools for understanding it are imperfect, and that this is okay. We do the best we can. We think carefully. We remain humble about our conclusions, and we keep exploring, keep questioning, keep thinking. The tickets rest quietly in their lottery, each one almost certain to lose, collectively certain that one will win. The paradox rests quietly in the structure of that situation, waiting to be discovered by anyone who thinks through the implications carefully. And you rest quietly as well, your mind having wandered through probability and belief, logic and language, individual confidence and collective impossibility. The journey has been gentle, the insight subtle, the conclusion open-ended, and that's exactly as it should be. In the soft darkness as sleep begins to approach, the details of the paradox become less important than the experience of having thought about it. The specific tickets, the exact probabilities, the various solutions, all of these fade into a general sense of having engaged with something interesting and worthwhile. What remains is a feeling of intellectual contentment, the satisfaction of having spent time with a good idea, the quiet pleasure of philosophical contemplation. The lottery paradox, like all good paradoxes, doesn't really end. It circles back on itself, inviting you to think again, to reconsider, to explore from a different angle. But for now, the circle can rest, the thinking can pause. The mind can settle into a comfortable quietness, carrying with it a faint echo of lottery tickets and probabilities, of beliefs that seem rational individually, but impossible collectively, of the subtle gap between almost certain and certain. And in that quietness there's room for sleep to arrive gently and naturally, bringing with it the rest that follows genuine intellectual engagement. The paradox has done its work. It has occupied the mind, provided something to think about, offered a puzzle worthy of attention. Now it can recede, leaving behind only a soft residual awareness that the world of ideas is vast and full of interesting corners, and that exploring those corners is one of the quiet joys of being human. The lottery tickets sit in their orderly arrangement, 1 through 1 million, each almost certain to lose, one certain to win. The paradox sits in its structure, elegant and persistent, showing where our intuitions about belief and probability come apart. And you sit in this moment of transition between waking thought and sleep, having travelled through the paradox's landscape, having appreciated its contours, ready now to let it go and drift into the restful darkness, where paradoxes dissolve and the mind can simply be. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. The barber paradox begins with a scenario that sounds perfectly reasonable, the kind of simple logical puzzle you might imagine happening in any quiet village tucked into a valley somewhere, where life moves at a manageable pace and everyone knows everyone else. Picture a small town with just enough people to support a single barber, a shopkeeper, a doctor perhaps, and not much else. In this town there is indeed one barber, and this barber operates according to a rule that seems, at first glance, to be about as clear and tidy as any rule could possibly be. The rule states that the barber shaves all and only those men in the town who do not shave themselves. Read that again slowly, because the wording matters quite a lot. The barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the barber shaves only men who do not shave themselves. It's a definition that feels satisfying in its symmetry, like a perfectly balanced equation, or a door that clicks shut with just the right amount of resistance. The rule divides the male population of the town into two neat groups, those who shave themselves and those who do not shave themselves. The barber's job, according to this rule, is to take care of the second group entirely and to leave the first group alone entirely. There's something appealing about definitions like this, definitions that promise completeness and precision. They suggest that every person in the town can be neatly classified, that there are no edge cases, no ambiguity, no need for judgment calls or exceptions. The rule sounds like it should work perfectly well, and for a moment it seems like the kind of harmless, logical arrangement that could govern a small community without any trouble at all. To understand why this particular rule has captured the attention of logicians, mathematicians, and philosophers for more than a century, it helps to think about what makes a good definition in the first place. Definitions are tools we use to organise the world, to draw boundaries around concepts and categories so that we can think and communicate clearly. When we define something, we're essentially creating a test. If something meets these criteria, it belongs in this category. If it doesn't, it belongs somewhere else. A good definition is precise enough to distinguish the thing being defined from everything else, but flexible enough to include all the cases it should include. A definition of chair, for example, should include three-legged stools and beanbag chairs and throne chairs and office chairs, but it should exclude tables and beds and ottomans, even though all of these are furniture designed for sitting or supporting the human body in various ways. The boundaries can be fuzzy in practice, but a definition at least gives us a framework for thinking about where those boundaries are. The rule about the barber seems at first to be a model of definitional clarity. It doesn't leave any room for interpretation or judgment. It doesn't say, the barber usually shaves men who don't shave themselves, or the barber tends to shave men who prefer not to shave themselves. It says all and only, which are the strongest possible quantifiers. All means every single member of the group, with no exceptions. Only means exclusively members of that group, with no one else included. When you put those two words together, you're creating a perfect one-to-one correspondence. The barber's customers are exactly the set of men who don't shave themselves, no more and no less. This kind of definition has a mathematical elegance to it, and it's the kind of definition that appears throughout formal systems of logic and mathematics. We say that a number is even if and only if it's divisible by 2. We say that a triangle is equilateral if and only if all 3 of its sides are the same length. These if and only if definitions, sometimes written as if in mathematical notation, create perfect equivalences between the thing being defined and its defining properties. But before we arrive at the contradiction, it's worth spending a little time unpacking what this rule actually says, because the paradox depends entirely on understanding the rule's structure with absolute clarity. The definition has 2 parts, and both parts are essential. The first part tells us that if a man in the town does not shave himself, then the barber shaves him. This is a promise of service, a guarantee that anyone who falls into the category of non-self-shavers will be taken care of by the barber. The second part tells us that if a man does shave himself, then the barber does not shave him. This is the exclusion clause, the part of the rule that says the barber only works with one group and not the other. Together, these 2 parts form a complete classification system. Every man in the town is either a self-shaver or a non-self-shaver, and the rule tells us exactly what the barber does in each case. The barber's service is perfectly matched to the population of non-self-shavers, and it excludes the population of self-shavers completely. There's no overlap, no gap, no uncertainty. At least, that's what the rule appears to promise. And for every man in the town except one, the rule works fine. If you pick any townsman at random, you can ask whether he shaves himself or not, and the rule will tell you whether the barber shaves him. If the townsman is a self-shaver, the barber doesn't shave him. If the townsman is a non-self-shaver, the barber does shave him. Simple, clear, consistent. The trouble begins when we remember that the barber himself is also a man who lives in this town. It's worth pausing here to consider why we even care about whether the barber is included in the rule. After all, we could simply say that the rule applies to all the other men in town, and the barber's shaving habits are determined by something else entirely. Perhaps the barber shaves himself on Mondays and Wednesdays, or perhaps the barber never shaves at all and wears a magnificent beard. If we exclude the barber from the domain of the rule, then there's no paradox at all. The rule works perfectly well for everyone else, and the barber is simply outside the system. But the whole point of the paradox is that it's presented as a universal rule, a rule that applies to all men in the town, and the barber is a man in the town. So if the rule is truly universal, if it really does apply to all men without exception, then it must apply to the barber as well. This is where the self-reference comes in, and this is where the trouble starts. The rule is trying to classify the barber based on the barber's own behaviour, and that creates a loop that cannot be escaped. The concept of self-reference appears in many different contexts, and it's worth taking a moment to explore why self-reference is such a powerful and sometimes problematic idea. In language, self-reference occurs when a sentence or phrase refers to itself. This sentence is in English, is a self-referential sentence that happens to be true. This sentence is in French, is a self-referential sentence that happens to be false. Both of these sentences are perfectly coherent. They refer to themselves, but they don't create any logical problems. But consider the sentence. This sentence is false. If the sentence is true, then what it says must be accurate, which means the sentence is false. If the sentence is false, then what it says is inaccurate, which means the sentence is true. This is the liar paradox, one of the oldest and most famous paradoxes in philosophy, and it's a direct result of self-reference combined with negation. The sentence refers to itself, and it makes a negative claim about itself, and those two features together create an inescapable loop. Self-reference appears in mathematics as well, often in the form of recursive definitions. A recursive definition is one that defines something in terms of itself, but with a base case that prevents infinite regress. For example, the factorial function is defined recursively. The factorial of n is n times the factorial of n minus 1, and the factorial of 0 is 1. This definition refers to itself. The factorial of n is defined in terms of the factorial of a smaller number, but it's perfectly valid because there's a base case that stops the recursion. When you calculate the factorial of 5, you calculate it in terms of the factorial of 4, which you calculate in terms of the factorial of 3, and so on, until you reach the factorial of 0, which is defined directly as 1. The recursion bottoms out, and the function is well defined. But if you try to define a function entirely in terms of itself, with no base case, you'd have a problem. Imagine a function f defined by the rule that f of n equals f of n plus 1. There's no way to calculate f for any value, because any attempt to do so sends you into an infinite loop. You need f of n, so you try to calculate f of n plus 1, but to calculate that you need f of n plus 2, and so on forever. The definition refers to itself but never bottoms out, and so it doesn't actually define anything at all. The Barber paradox combines self-reference with a kind of logical negation in a way that's similar to the liar paradox. The rule says the barber shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. When we apply this rule to the barber, we're asking whether the barber shaves himself, and the answer depends on whether the barber is in the category of men who do not shave themselves. But whether the barber is in that category depends on whether the barber shaves himself, which is the very question we're trying to answer. We've created a loop where the answer depends on itself, and the dependency is negative. The barber shaves himself if and only if he doesn't shave himself. This is logically impossible, and that's what makes it a paradox. So now we arrive at the central question, the question that transforms this tidy little rule into something much stranger. The question is simply this: does the barber shave himself? It's a straightforward question, the kind of question that should have a straightforward answer. After all, the barber is a man, and the rule is supposed to apply to all the men in the town, so it should apply to him as well. He must either shave himself or not shave himself, just like everyone else. There are only two possibilities, and the rule is designed to cover both possibilities completely, so we should be able to answer the question without any difficulty. And yet, as soon as we try to answer it, something very strange happens. This is the moment when the definition, which seemed so clear and so complete, turns inward and begins to consume itself. The rule that worked perfectly well for everyone else suddenly fails when we try to apply it to the barber. And the failure is not a matter of missing information or unclear wording. The failure is structural, built into the logic of the rule itself. Let's try to answer the question by assuming the barber does shave himself. This seems like a reasonable starting point. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves. He is a self-shaver. But now we look back at the rule, which says that the barber shaves all and only those men who do not shave themselves. If the barber is a self-shaver, then he is not a member of the group that the barber shaves. The rule explicitly excludes self-shavers from the barber's service. So if the barber shaves himself, then according to the rule, the barber should not shave him. But the barber should not shave him means the barber should not shave the barber, which means the barber should not shave himself. So we've reached a conclusion that contradicts our starting assumption. We assumed the barber shaves himself, and this assumption, combined with the rule, led us to conclude that the barber does not shave himself. The assumption has collapsed into its opposite. This is already troubling, but perhaps we simply started with the wrong assumption. Perhaps the barber does not shave himself, and if we assume that instead, everything will work out. So let's try the other option. Suppose the barber does not shave himself. If the barber does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves. He is a non-self-shaver, but the rule says the barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves. If the barber is a non-self-shaver, then the barber must shave him. But the barber must shave him means the barber must shave the barber, which means the barber must shave himself. So now we've reached the opposite conclusion. We assumed the barber does not shave himself, and this assumption, combined with the rule, led us to conclude that the barber does shave himself. Once again, the assumption has flipped into its opposite, and now we're caught in a loop that has no exit. If the barber shaves himself, then he doesn't shave himself. If he doesn't shave himself, then he does shave himself. Neither answer is stable. Neither answer satisfies the rule. We've created a situation where every possible answer leads to a contradiction. This is what makes the barber paradox a genuine paradox, and not just a puzzle with a missing piece of information. The problem is not that we don't know enough about the barber or the town. The problem is not that the rule is vaguely worded, or that we're misunderstanding what shave means. The rule is perfectly clear, and we understand it completely. The problem is that the rule, as stated, cannot be satisfied in reality. It describes a situation that cannot exist. The rule tries to create a perfect boundary between two groups, self-shavers and non-self-shavers, and it tries to make the barber's service fit that boundary exactly. But when the barber himself is included in the population that the rule describes, the boundary breaks down. The rule generates a contradiction, not because we're applying it incorrectly, but because the rule itself is logically impossible when applied universally. The barber's behaviour, whatever it might be, is not the issue. The issue is the structure of the rule, the way it attempts to classify the barber using a classification system that depends on the barber's own classification. This is the heart of the paradox, and it's worth sitting with that idea for a moment, because it reveals something important about how definitions work and where they can fail. To understand the deeper significance of this failure, it helps to think about the history of logic and mathematics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the barber paradox and its more formal cousin, Russell's paradox, first emerged. At that time, mathematicians were engaged in a grand project to put all of mathematics on a rigorous logical foundation. The goal was to show that all mathematical truths could be derived from a small set of axioms using purely logical rules of inference. This project, sometimes called logicism, was driven by figures like Gottlob Frege, who spent decades developing a formal system that would ground arithmetic in logic. Frege's work was brilliant and intricate, a monument of careful reasoning and precise definition. And then, in 1902, Bertrand Russell discovered a paradox in Frege's system, a paradox that showed the foundations were not as solid as they had seemed. Russell's paradox is more abstract than the barber paradox, but it has exactly the same logical structure. In Frege's system, sets could be defined by any property whatsoever. If you had a property, you could collect all the things with that property into a set. So you could have the set of all even numbers, the set of all red things, the set of all countries in Europe, and so on. And crucially, sets could contain other sets as members. The set of all sets of even numbers, for example, is itself a set. Most sets do not contain themselves as members. The set of all even numbers is not itself an even number, so it doesn't contain itself. The set of all red things is not itself a red thing, so it doesn't contain itself. But some sets, at least in principle, could contain themselves. The set of all sets, for example, is itself a set, so it would contain itself. The set of all things that are not apples is not an apple, so it would contain itself. Russell asked a simple question. What about the set of all sets that do not contain themselves? Let's call this set R. If R does not contain itself, then it has the property of being a set that does not contain itself, which means it should be a member of R. But if R is a member of R, then R contains itself, which means it does not have the property of being a set that does not contain itself, which means it should not be a member of R. The same loop. If R contains itself, it doesn't. If it doesn't, it does. Russell communicated this paradox to Frege in a letter, and Frege immediately recognized the devastating implications. The paradox showed that Frege's system, which was supposed to be the rigorous logical foundation for all of mathematics, was inconsistent. An inconsistent system is one that can prove both a statement and its negation, and once you have an inconsistency, the entire system collapses. In classical logic, from a contradiction, you can derive anything at all. If you can prove both that some statement is true and that it's false, you can use those two facts to prove that 2 plus 2 equals 5, or that the moon is made of cheese, or that pigs can fly. An inconsistent system is worse than useless. It's completely unreliable. Frege's response to Russell's letter was gracious and honest. He acknowledged the problem and added a note to the second volume of his life's work, which was about to be published, essentially saying that the foundation of the entire project had been shown to be unsound. It was a moment of intellectual humility and integrity, but also a moment of profound disappointment. Decades of work had been undermined by a simple paradox about self-reference. The discovery of Russell's paradox and other related paradoxes sent shockwaves through the mathematical community. It became clear that naive set theory, the idea that you could form a set from any property, was inconsistent. Mathematicians and logicians spent the early decades of the 20th century developing new foundations that would avoid the paradoxes while preserving as much as possible of the power and flexibility of set theory. Several different approaches emerged. Bertrand Russell himself, along with Alfred North Whitehead, developed a system called type theory, which avoided the paradoxes by arranging sets into a hierarchy of types. In type theory, a set of one type can only contain elements of a lower type, which prevents a set from containing itself. This blocks Russell's paradox because the set of all sets that don't contain themselves can't be formed in the first place. The question of whether such a set contains itself doesn't even make sense in the type hierarchy. Type theory works in the sense that it's consistent and it can serve as a foundation for mathematics, but it's also somewhat cumbersome and artificial. The hierarchy of types feels like a restriction imposed to avoid the paradoxes, rather than a natural feature of the mathematical landscape. Another approach, developed by Ernst Zermelo and later refined by Abraham Frankel and others, became known as Zermelo-Frankel set theory, or ZF for short. This system takes a different approach to avoiding the paradoxes. Instead of arranging sets into a hierarchy, ZF restricts which sets can be formed by providing a specific list of axioms that govern set construction. In ZF, you can't just form a set from any arbitrary property. You can only form sets using certain allowed operations, like taking the union of two sets, or forming the set of all subsets of a given set, or selecting elements from an existing set that satisfy some property. These axioms are carefully chosen to be powerful enough to do all the mathematics we care about, while being restrictive enough to avoid the paradoxes. In particular, ZF does not allow unrestricted comprehension, the principle that any property defines a set. Instead, it allows separation. If you already have a set, you can form a subset of it consisting of the elements that that satisfy some property. This means you can't form the set of all sets that don't contain themselves, because you'd need to start with the set of all sets, and there is no such thing in ZF. The collection of all sets is too big to be a set. It's what's called a proper class, something that exists in the theory, but can't be treated as a single object. ZF set theory, possibly with the addition of the axiom of choice to form ZFC, has become the standard foundation for modern mathematics. It's the system that most mathematicians implicitly work within, even if they don't think about it explicitly. And it's a system that successfully avoids Russell's paradox and other related paradoxes by being careful about which sets can be formed and how. But the fact that we needed to be this careful, the fact that naive set theory turned out to be inconsistent, is a profound lesson about the limits of definition and the dangers of self-reference. The Barber paradox and Russell's paradox show that not all conceptually clear definitions correspond to logically possible objects. Sometimes a definition can be perfectly grammatical, perfectly understandable, and yet logically incoherent. And when that happens, we need to either revise the definition or recognize that it doesn't refer to anything real. The broader philosophical implications of these paradoxes have been debated for more than a century. Some philosophers argue that the paradoxes reveal deep truths about the nature of truth, meaning, and reality. They suggest that our ordinary concepts of set membership, truth, and predication are fundamentally flawed, and that we need to revise our understanding of these concepts in light of the paradoxes. Others argue that the paradoxes are artifacts of formal systems and don't tell us anything deep about reality, only about the limits of certain kinds of formalization. Still others argue that the paradoxes point to important boundaries between what can be said and what can be done, between language and reality, between syntax and semantics. There's no consensus on the ultimate philosophical significance of these paradoxes, but what's clear is that they matter. They're not just technical curiosities, they touch on fundamental questions about logic, language, and the foundations of mathematics. One way to think about the Barber paradox and Russell's paradox is as examples of what happens when we try to make our definitions too comprehensive, too all-encompassing. There's a natural human desire for completeness, for systems that cover every case, for rules that apply universally without exception. We want our definitions to be neat and tidy, to divide the world into clean categories with no borderline cases and no ambiguities. And most of the time, this works fine. We can define even numbers as those divisible by 2, and odd numbers as those not divisible by 2, and these definitions partition the integers perfectly, with no overlap and no gaps. We can define triangles as 3-sided polygons, and this definition successfully picks out all and only the triangles. But when we try to create definitions that refer back to themselves, we need to be more careful. Self-reference introduces the possibility of circular dependencies, of definitions that chase their own tails, of rules that generate contradictions when applied to themselves. The Barber paradox is a simple, concrete example of this danger, a warning sign that says, be careful with self-reference, because it can break your system in subtle ways. It's also worth noting that paradoxes like these have practical implications beyond pure mathematics and philosophy. In computer science, for example, self-reference and recursion are fundamental concepts, and programmers need to be constantly aware of the dangers they pose. A recursive function is one that calls itself, and recursion is an incredibly powerful programming technique. Many algorithms are most naturally expressed recursively, from tree traversal to sorting to mathematical computations. But recursion can also go wrong. If a recursive function doesn't have a proper base case, or if the base case is never reached, the function will call itself indefinitely, creating an infinite loop that eventually crashes the program by exhausting the available memory. This is called a stack overflow, and it's one of the most common programming errors. The stack is the region of memory where the computer stores information about active function calls, and each recursive call adds a new frame to the stack. If the recursion never ends, the stack keeps growing until it runs out of space and the program fails. Programmers learn to be very careful with recursion. They make sure that every recursive function has a clearly defined base case, a condition under which the function returns a value directly without making another recursive call. They make sure that each recursive call makes progress toward the base case so that the recursion is guaranteed to terminate eventually. And they test their recursive functions carefully to make sure they behave correctly, even in edge cases. The Barber paradox doesn't map directly onto any programming problem, but it illustrates the same underlying issue. Self-reference needs to be managed carefully, with clear rules about when the self-reference stops, or else you end up in an infinite loop or a logical contradiction. Another area where self-reference creates interesting problems is in formal logic and the theory of computation. In the 1930s, Kurt Gödel proved his famous incompleteness theorems, which showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system capable of expressing arithmetic contains statements that are true but unprovable within the system. Gödel's proof is a masterpiece of logical reasoning, and it relies heavily on self-reference. Gödel showed how to encode statements about the formal system itself as statements within the system, creating a kind of mathematical self-reference. He then constructed a statement that essentially says, this statement is not provable, and showed that if the system is consistent, then this statement must be true, but unprovable. The self-reference is the key to the whole proof, and it's similar in spirit to the self-reference in the liar paradox and the Barber paradox, though technically much more sophisticated. Gödel's incompleteness theorems were another blow to the dream of finding a complete and consistent logical foundation for all of mathematics. They showed that no matter how carefully you construct your formal system, if it's powerful enough to do arithmetic, it will always be incomplete. There will always be true statements that you can't prove within the system. This doesn't mean mathematics is broken or unreliable. It just means that mathematical truth is bigger than any single formal system can capture. There's no algorithm, no mechanical procedure that can decide the truth of every mathematical statement. Some truths require insight, creativity, intuition, things that go beyond the purely mechanical application of logical rules. The connection between Gödel's theorems and the Barber paradox might not be immediately obvious, but they're part of the same family of results about the limits of formal systems. They all involve self-reference in some form, and they all show that when you allow systems to refer to themselves, you can sometimes derive surprising and counterintuitive conclusions. The Barber paradox shows that self-referential definitions can be inconsistent. Gödel's theorems show that self-referential statements can be true but unprovable. Both results tell us that formal systems have boundaries, that there are things they cannot do, that completeness and consistency and decidability are not always achievable together. In the decades following Gödel's work, other mathematicians and computer scientists discovered more results in the same vein. Alan Turing, while developing the theory of computation in the 1930s, proved that there are certain questions about computer programs that cannot be answered by any algorithm. The most famous of these is the halting problem, which asks, given a program and an input, will the program eventually halt, or will it run forever? Turing showed that there is no general algorithm that can answer this question for all possible programs and inputs. The proof involves a self-referential construction similar to Gödel's, where you imagine a program that analyzes itself and derives a contradiction if such an algorithm existed. The halting problem is undecidable, meaning there's no algorithmic solution to it, and this places fundamental limits on what computers can do. And no matter how powerful computers become, no matter how much memory they have or how fast they run, they will never be able to solve the halting problem in general. These results, Russell's paradox, Gödel's incompleteness theorems, Turing's undecidability results, form a constellation of negative results about the limits of formalization and computation. They show that there are things we cannot define consistently, things we cannot prove even when they're true, and things we cannot compute even in principle. And they all involve self-reference in one way or another. The Barber paradox is the simplest and most accessible member of this family, a gentle introduction to ideas that become increasingly abstract and technical as you go deeper into logic, mathematics, and computer science. But even though the Barber paradox is simple, it captures the essential insight. Self-reference can be dangerous, and systems that refer to themselves need to be constructed with great care. There's also something philosophically interesting about the fact that these paradoxes arise from our attempt to be as precise and rigorous as possible. In everyday life, we're often comfortable with vagueness and ambiguity. We use words like tall and bald and heap, even though they don't have sharp boundaries. How many hairs do you need to lose before you're bald? How many grains of sand make a heap? These questions don't have precise answers, and that's fine. We navigate the world successfully, despite the vagueness of our language. But in mathematics and logic, we strive for perfect precision. We want definitions that are crystal clear, rules that are completely unambiguous, systems that leave no room for interpretation. And paradoxically, it's this very striving for precision that leads us into trouble. The Barber paradox arises because we tried to make the rule perfectly clear and perfectly comprehensive. If the rule had been vague or incomplete, if it had said something like, "The barber usually shaves men who don't feel like shaving themselves," there would be no paradox. The barber could shave himself sometimes, and not other times, and there would be no contradiction. But we wanted a rule that was precise and complete, a rule that covered all cases with no exceptions. And that's what created the problem. This suggests that there might be a fundamental tension between precision and self-reference, between completeness and consistency, between the desire to have rules that cover everything and the reality that some self-referential rules cannot exist. In formal systems, this tension has been resolved by accepting incompleteness, by acknowledging that no single system can be both complete and consistent and capable of expressing its own truth predicate. In everyday life, we resolve the tension by being less precise, by allowing vagueness and context dependence, by accepting that our rules and definitions are good enough for practical purposes, even if they're not perfect. The Barber paradox lives in the border zone between these two approaches, precise enough to create a contradiction, but simple enough to be understood without any technical machinery. Now let's return to the paradox itself and think about it from a slightly different angle. Instead of focusing on the formal logic, let's think about what would actually happen if you tried to implement this rule in a real town with a real barber. Imagine you're the mayor of a small town and you decide to hire a barber and give him this rule. Shave all and only those men who do not shave themselves. The barber opens his shop, and for a while everything seems to work fine. Men come in, and the barber asks them, "Do you shave yourself?" If they say yes, he turns them away. If they say no, he shaves them. The system works smoothly. But then one morning the barber wakes up, looks in the mirror, and realizes he needs a shave. He's the only barber in town, so if he needs a shave, he has to either do it himself or go without. What does he do? If the barber is a thoughtful person, he might realize that there's a problem. He might go to the mayor and say, "Your rule doesn't work. You've told me to shave all and only those men who don't shave themselves. But you haven't told me what to do about myself. If I shave myself, I'm violating the rule, because I'm supposed to shave only men who don't shave themselves. But if I don't shave myself, I'm also violating the rule, because I'm supposed to shave all men who don't shave themselves. The rule is impossible to follow." And the mayor, if the mayor is a reasonable person, might respond, "Oh, I see the problem. Let me revise the rule. You should shave all and only those other men in town who do not shave themselves. Your own shaving habits are your business, not part of the rule." And just like that, the paradox is resolved. The rule is clarified to exclude the barber from its own domain, and everyone goes on with their lives. This is essentially how the paradox is resolved in practice, by recognizing that the rule, as originally stated, cannot be implemented and needs to be modified. Either the barber is excluded from the rule's domain, or the rule is changed to be less comprehensive, or we acknowledge that the rule describes an impossible situation and abandon it altogether. But the fact that the rule needs to be modified or abandoned is itself interesting and important. It shows that not every plausible sounding rule can be made to work in reality. It shows that language can lead us astray, that we can formulate sentences that sound meaningful but that don't correspond to any possible state of affairs. And it shows that when we encounter these impossible situations, the right response is not to stubbornly insist that there must be an answer, but to step back and recognize that the question is flawed. There's a certain kind of wisdom in knowing when to abandon a question rather than trying to force an answer. In philosophy, this is sometimes called dissolving a problem rather than solving it. Some philosophical problems, the argument goes, are not problems at all, but confusions created by imprecise language or incoherent concepts. When you encounter such a pseudo-problem, the right response is not to work harder at solving it, but to recognize that it's based on a mistake and to reformulate the question in a clearer way. The barber paradox is a toy example of this kind of situation. The question, "Does the barber shave himself?" seems like it should have an answer, but once we see that it leads to a contradiction, we realize that the question is flawed. The rule that generates the question is incoherent, and the right response is not to answer the question, but to recognize that it cannot be answered and to revise the rule. This approach to paradoxes, dissolving them by revising the framework that creates them, is one of several possible approaches. Another approach is to accept the paradox as a genuine feature of reality or of our conceptual systems, and to try to develop frameworks that can accommodate it. Some logicians have developed paraconsistent logics, logical systems that can tolerate contradictions without collapsing into incoherence. In classical logic, as we mentioned earlier, a single contradiction allows you to prove anything at all, which makes the system useless. But in paraconsistent logic, contradictions are isolated so that they don't spread throughout the system. You can have some statements that are both true and false, and this doesn't allow you to prove arbitrary statements. Paraconsistent logic is controversial and not widely used in mathematics, but it has some applications in computer science, philosophy, and artificial intelligence, particularly in situations where you might be working with inconsistent databases or conflicting information from different sources. Another approach to paradoxes is to accept that some questions simply don't have determinate answers, that there are gaps in our conceptual schemes where nothing forces a particular answer one way or another. This approach, sometimes associated with intuitionist or constructivist mathematics, holds that mathematical objects don't exist independently of our ability to construct them, and that statements about such objects are only meaningful if we have a method for verifying them. From this perspective, the barber paradox shows that the rule defining the barber's behaviour doesn't successfully construct a determinate situation, and so questions about the barber's shaving habits don't have determinate answers. This is not because we're ignorant of the facts, but because the facts don't exist, the rule fails to create a coherent situation in the first place. Yet another approach, common in philosophy of language, is to argue that the barber paradox reveals something important about the semantics of self-referential statements. According to this view, statements can only be evaluated as true or false relative to a particular level or context. And self-referential statements that try to span multiple levels create problems. The liar paradox, for instance, might be resolved by saying that when a sentence refers to its own truth value, it's referring to a different semantic level than the one at which it makes its claim, and this category mistake creates the appearance of a paradox. Similarly, the barber paradox might be seen as a case where the rule tries to operate at a level that includes itself, creating a category mistake that generates a contradiction. All of these approaches have their merits and their advocates, and the debates among them continue in the philosophical and logical literature. But for our purposes, the important point is that the barber paradox, despite its simplicity, connects to deep and ongoing discussions about logic, language, mathematics, and the foundations of our conceptual systems. It's not just a puzzle or a trick, it's a window into fundamental questions about how we define things, how we reason about them, and what the limits of our reasoning might be. Let's also consider the barber paradox from a more practical human perspective. Suppose you were the barber in this situation, and you genuinely wanted to follow the rule as best you could. You might try various strategies to avoid the contradiction. For instance, you might decide that the question of whether you shave yourself will be determined by chance. You could flip a coin each morning. Heads, you shave yourself. Tails, you don't. This doesn't resolve the logical contradiction, but it does give you a way to proceed without having to think about the paradox every day. Of course, on the days when the coin comes up heads and you shave yourself, you're technically violating the rule, and on the days when it comes up tails and you don't shave yourself, you're also technically violating the rule. But at least you're making a decision and getting on with your life, even if the decision doesn't satisfy the rule perfectly. Or you might try to reinterpret the rule in a way that makes it workable. Maybe you decide that shave means provide a professional shaving service, and when you shave yourself at home, that doesn't count as the barber shaving you because you're not providing yourself with a professional service. This is a bit of a stretch, but it's the kind of creative reinterpretation that people often use when faced with impossible rules in real life. We find loopholes, we make distinctions, we interpret the letter of the law in ways that make it possible to comply even when the spirit of the law seems to create contradictions. This is not dishonest or evasive. It's a practical response to the fact that rules, especially very general rules, sometimes create impossible situations when applied to particular cases. Or you might simply grow a beard and stop shaving altogether, removing yourself from the domain of the rule. If you don't shave at all, then the question of whether the barber shaves you doesn't arise. This is another practical solution, though it doesn't resolve the logical paradox. It just sidesteps it by changing the situation so that the paradoxical question doesn't come up. These practical responses illustrate an important point. In real life, we don't usually encounter paradoxes in their pure form. We encounter messy situations where rules conflict or seem to create impossible requirements, and we find ways to work around them. We revise the rules, we reinterpret them, we make exceptions, we find creative solutions. The barber paradox, presented in its pure logical form, doesn't have these escape routes. The rule is what it is, the situation is what it is, and the contradiction is unavoidable. But that's because the paradox is an idealization, a thought experiment designed to illustrate a logical point, not a real-world problem that needs a practical solution. And yet, even as an idealization, the barber paradox can help us think more clearly about real-world situations. Whenever you encounter a rule that seems to create impossible requirements, whenever you find yourself in a situation where every option seems to violate some principle or create some problem, it's worth asking whether you're facing a genuine barber paradox, a situation where the rule itself is incoherent and needs to be revised, or whether there's some creative solution that you haven't thought of yet. Sometimes the right response is to recognize that the rule is broken and to work on fixing the rule rather than trying to force a solution within the existing framework. Other times, the right response is to keep looking for creative workarounds and reinterpretations that make the situation workable. The Barber paradox teaches us to distinguish between these cases, to recognize when we're facing a genuine logical impossibility versus a merely difficult practical challenge. There's also a sense in which the Barber paradox is a story about categories and boundaries and the difficulty of making them perfectly clean. In the paradox, we're trying to divide all men into two categories, those who shave themselves and those who don't. This seems like it should be straightforward. It's a binary distinction, an either-or choice. Either you shave yourself or you don't. What could be simpler? And for most people, the distinction is indeed clear and unproblematic. But when we try to apply this distinction to the barber using the rule that defines the barber's service, in terms of the distinction itself, we run into trouble. The category breaks down. The boundary becomes unstable. And this is a general feature of self-referential categories. When a category is defined in terms of membership in itself, strange things can happen. This has echoes in other areas of thought. In social and political contexts, for instance, we often encounter self-referential categories that can create paradoxes or at least deep tensions. Consider the question of tolerance. Should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? If you say yes, then you're allowing intolerant views to flourish, which might eventually destroy the tolerant society. If you say no, then you're being intolerant of certain views, which seems to contradict the principle of tolerance. This is sometimes called the paradox of tolerance, and while it's not exactly the same as the Barber paradox, it has a similar structure. The principle of tolerance, when applied to itself, creates a tension or contradiction. The resolution, as with the Barber paradox, usually involves recognizing that the principle cannot be applied absolutely and universally without qualification. A tolerant society might tolerate most views but draw a line at views that actively seek to destroy tolerance itself. This is not a perfect solution, and there's much debate about exactly where to draw that line, but it's a practical response to a self-referential tension in our political principles. Or consider the question of who guards the guardians, a question that goes back to ancient philosophy. If you set up a group of people to watch over society and make sure everyone follows the rules, who makes sure the guardians themselves follow the rules? If you create a second group to watch the first group, who watches the second group? You can keep adding levels of oversight, but at some point you either have to stop and accept that someone is trusted without oversight, or you create an infinite regress of watchers watching watchers. This is not quite a paradox, but it's a structural problem created by the self-referential nature of authority and oversight. The practical solutions usually involve things like separation of powers, checks and balances, democratic accountability, and cultural norms of integrity. These don't eliminate the logical tension, but they manage it in ways that work reasonably well in practice. The Barber paradox, by presenting a pure and simple case of self-referential contradiction, helps us see this pattern more clearly. It shows us that whenever we try to create comprehensive, self-applying rules, we need to be careful. We need to think about whether the rule can coherently apply to itself, or whether we need to carve out exceptions, or whether the rule needs to be limited in scope. And if we find ourselves in a situation where the rule creates a genuine contradiction when applied to itself, we need to be willing to revise the rule rather than insisting that there must somehow be a way to make it work. Let's think now about the educational value of the Barber paradox and why it continues to be taught and discussed. One reason is that it's accessible. You don't need any special background to understand it. You don't need to know set theory or formal logic or advanced mathematics. You just need to be able to follow a simple argument. This makes it an ideal teaching tool for introducing students to the concept of logical paradoxes and the importance of careful reasoning. When a teacher presents the Barber paradox to a class, the students can immediately grasp the setup, follow the argument step by step, and see the contradiction for themselves. There's no need to take anything on faith or to trust that the teacher knows what they're talking about. The paradox speaks for itself. Another reason the barber paradox is valuable is that it's memorable. The image of a barber in a small town, the simple rule about who gets shaved, the question of whether the barber shaves himself, these are concrete and vivid. Students who learn about the barber paradox tend to remember it years later, even if they forget other things they learned in the same class. And because they remember it, they can use it as a reference point when thinking about other problems. When they encounter a situation that involves self-reference or circular definitions, they might think, oh, this is like the barber paradox, and that recognition can help them see what's going wrong and how to fix it. The barber paradox is also valuable because it illustrates a pattern that appears in many different contexts. As we've discussed, the same basic structure shows up in Russell's paradox, the liar paradox, Gödel's incompleteness theorems, the halting problem, and various philosophical and practical problems involving self-reference and self-application. By learning the barber paradox, students learn a pattern that will serve them well throughout their intellectual lives. They learn to recognize self-reference, to be cautious about it, to think carefully about whether self-referential definitions are coherent, and to be willing to revise their frameworks when they run into contradictions. There's also something intellectually humbling and liberating about the barber paradox. It shows that even very smart people, even experts in logic and mathematics, can be surprised by simple contradictions hidden in seemingly clear definitions. Frege, one of the greatest logicians of all time, spent decades building a logical system that turned out to have a fatal flaw revealed by Russell's paradox. This doesn't mean Frege was foolish or incompetent. It means that logical paradoxes are genuinely subtle and tricky, and even the most careful thinkers can miss them. For students, this can be reassuring. If Frege can be caught by a paradox, then there's no shame in finding them confusing or surprising. And if Russell can discover a paradox in Frege's system, then there's hope for all of us. Careful thought and clear reasoning can reveal hidden problems, even in the work of giants. At the same time, the barber paradox is liberating because it shows that some problems that seem impossibly difficult are actually impossible, period. If you're struggling with a question and you can't find an answer, no matter how hard you try, sometimes the reason is that the question is badly formed or based on inconsistent assumptions. Recognizing this can free you from the burden of trying to solve an unsolvable problem. You can stop spinning your wheels and instead work on reformulating the question or revising your assumptions. This is a valuable lesson not just in logic and mathematics, but in life more generally. Some problems are hard and we need to work harder to solve them, but some problems are impossible, and we need to be smart enough to recognize them as such and to redirect our efforts accordingly. The barber paradox also invites reflection on the relationship between form and content, between the structure of an argument and its meaning. The paradox has a very specific logical structure, a self-referential definition that creates a contradiction when applied to itself. But this structure can be dressed up in many different guises. The barber paradox uses a story about shaving. Russell's paradox uses the abstract language of set theory. The liar paradox uses a statement about truth. The underlying structure is the same in all cases, but the surface presentation differs. This teaches us to look past the surface details and to focus on the underlying logical form. When we encounter a new problem, we can ask, is this structurally similar to something I've seen before? Does it have the same pattern of self-reference and contradiction? If so, I can apply the lessons I learned from the earlier case. This kind of structural thinking is at the heart of mathematics and logic. Mathematicians are constantly looking for patterns, analogies, and structural similarities across different areas. A theorem proved in one area of mathematics might have an analogous theorem in a completely different area. because the underlying structure is the same even though the objects being studied are different. The Barber paradox, by presenting a clear and simple logical structure, helps train students to think structurally, to see the skeleton beneath the flesh, to recognize when two superficially different problems are fundamentally the same. Now let's consider how the Barber paradox relates to some broader themes in philosophy and human thought. One such theme is the question of whether reality is ultimately consistent and coherent, or whether there are genuine contradictions in the world. Most of us, most of the time, assume that reality is consistent. We believe that for any proposition, either it's true or it's false, not both. We believe that contradictions are signs of errors in our thinking, not features of reality itself. The law of non-contradiction, the principle that a statement and its negation cannot both be true, is one of the foundational principles of classical logic and has been accepted by most philosophers since ancient times. But some philosophers and logicians have questioned this assumption. Dialetheism is the view that there are true contradictions, statements that are both true and false at the same time. Dialetheists argue that paradoxes like the liar paradox show that contradictions can be true, and that we should accept this rather than trying to explain the paradoxes away. According to dialetheism, when we encounter a statement like, "This statement is false," we should simply accept that it's both true and false, and develop logical systems that can handle such statements without collapsing. This is a radical view, and it's not widely accepted, but it has some adherents, and has led to interesting work in non-classical logic. The Barber paradox can be seen as relevant to this debate. If you're a classical logician, you'll say that the Barber paradox shows that the rule defining the barbers' behaviour is incoherent and doesn't correspond to any possible situation. The contradiction is a sign that something is wrong with the rule, not a sign that the barber both shaves himself and doesn't shave himself. But if you're sympathetic to dialetheism, you might say that the Barber paradox presents a genuine contradiction that we should accept. The barber both shaves himself and doesn't shave himself, and while this is strange and counterintuitive, it's not impossible if we're willing to embrace true contradictions. Most logicians and philosophers reject dialetheism, and the standard response to the Barber paradox remains that the situation it describes cannot exist, and that the rule needs to be revised or abandoned. But the existence of the dialetheist position shows that even seemingly settled questions about paradoxes can be reopened and debated. The Barber paradox, simple as it is, connects to deep and ongoing philosophical discussions about the nature of truth, contradiction, and logical consequence. Another philosophical theme connected to the Barber paradox is the question of vagueness and Sorite's paradoxes. A Sorite's paradox arises when you have a vague predicate like bald or heap, and you try to apply it to a series of cases that differ by imperceptible amounts. For example, a man with 0 hairs on his head is clearly bald. If you add 1 hair, he's still bald. If you keep adding 1 hair at a time, at what point does he stop being bald? There's no sharp boundary, and yet if you keep adding hairs, you'll eventually reach someone who's clearly not bald. The Sorite's paradox arises from trying to force a sharp boundary onto a vague predicate. The Barber paradox is different from a Sorite's paradox because it doesn't involve vagueness. The terms are perfectly precise. Shaves himself is a clear binary property. Either someone shaves themselves or they don't. There's no borderline case, no fuzzy boundary, and yet both types of paradoxes involve problems with categorization and boundaries. The Sorite's paradox shows that some boundaries are inherently vague and resist sharp definition. The Barber paradox shows that some boundaries, even when sharply defined, create contradictions when they're self-referential. Together, these paradoxes teach us that the project of dividing the world into neat categories is more fraught than it might initially seem. Sometimes categories are vague, and sometimes categories are self-contradictory. and we need to be aware of both kinds of problems. Let's also think about the aesthetic dimension of the Barber paradox. There's a kind of mathematical beauty in a good paradox, a elegance in the way it takes you from a simple, innocent-seeming premise to a surprising and counterintuitive conclusion. The Barber paradox has this quality. It starts with a rule that sounds perfectly reasonable, asks a natural question, and arrives at a contradiction through flawless reasoning. There are no tricks, no hidden assumptions, no verbal sleight of hand. Every step is clear and justified, and yet the conclusion is shocking. The situation cannot exist. There's something deeply satisfying about this, in the same way that a good magic trick is satisfying. You see every step of the trick, you understand how it works, and yet the result still surprises you. Mathematicians and logicians often speak of beautiful proofs, elegant arguments, deep theorems. The Barber paradox, while not a theorem in the usual sense, has this quality of mathematical beauty. It's simple, clear, surprising, and profound. It illuminates something important about logic and definition without requiring elaborate machinery or technical sophistication. This aesthetic quality is part of why the paradox has endured and why it continues to be taught and discussed. It's not just useful, it's also beautiful. There's also a playful quality to the Barber paradox that makes it appealing. It has the flavour of a riddle or a puzzle, something you might pose to a friend to see if they can figure out what's wrong. And indeed, paradoxes have often been used in exactly this way, as intellectual puzzles meant to challenge and entertain. The ancient Greeks enjoyed paradoxes and used them both as serious philosophical tools and as rhetorical games. Zeno's paradoxes about motion, for instance, were presented as challenges to the common sense view that motion is possible, and they sparked serious philosophical and mathematical work on infinity and continuity. But they also had a playful element, a sense of, here's a clever argument that seems to prove something absurd. Can you figure out what's wrong with it? The Barber paradox fits into this tradition. It's serious in its implications, but it's also fun to think about, fun to share with others, fun to see people's faces when they first grasp the contradiction. This playfulness is not a distraction from the serious work of logic and philosophy. It's an integral part of it. Thinking is not just a solemn, dutiful activity. It can be joyful, playful, creative. Paradoxes remind us of this. They invite us to play with ideas, to see what happens when we push concepts to their limits, to enjoy the surprise of discovering that something we thought we understood has hidden depths and unexpected twists. And this brings us to a final thought about the Barber paradox and its place in human intellectual history. Paradoxes have always been with us, from the ancient Greeks to the present day, and they've always played an important role in driving intellectual progress. When we encounter a paradox, we're forced to think more carefully about our assumptions, to question concepts we took for granted, to develop new frameworks and new tools for understanding. Russell's paradox led to the development of modern set theory. The liar paradox sparked centuries of work on truth, language, and logic. Zeno's paradoxes contributed to the development of calculus and the modern understanding of infinity. Paradoxes are not just curiosities. They're engines of progress, points of tension that drive us to refine our understanding and develop new ideas. The Barber paradox, as a simple and accessible version of Russell's paradox, has played its own small role in this larger story. It has helped countless students understand the dangers of self-reference and the importance of careful definition. It has served as a gateway to deeper questions about logic, mathematics, and philosophy. And it has reminded us, generation after generation, that seemingly simple questions can hide deep complexities, that language can lead us astray, and that the project of understanding the world and our own thought processes is an ongoing challenge that requires vigilance, creativity, and humility. And so we arrive, once again, at the end of this exploration of the barber paradox. We've examined it from many angles, its logical structure, its historical context, its connections to other paradoxes, and to broader themes in mathematics, philosophy, computer science, and human thought. We've seen how it arises from self-reference, how it reveals the limits of definition, and how it teaches us to be careful about comprehensive rules that apply to themselves. We've thought about how it might play out in practice, how it relates to real-world problems, and what it tells us about categories, boundaries, and the relationship between language and reality. The barber stands in his shop, razor in hand, contemplating the rule that defines his work. The rule is clear: shave all and only those men who do not shave themselves. The question remains, does the barber shave himself? And the answer, we now understand fully and completely, is that the question cannot be answered because the situation cannot exist. The rule describes something impossible, a logical contradiction, dressed up as a simple story about a barber in a small town. And in recognizing this impossibility, in understanding why the contradiction arises and what it teaches us, we have learned something valuable about logic, language, and the limits of our conceptual systems. The barber paradox has served its purpose. It has illuminated a corner of the logical landscape, revealed a boundary where clear definitions can fail, and reminded us that not all grammatically correct sentences correspond to possible states of affairs. And with that understanding, we can lay the paradox to rest, confident that we have grasped its lesson and absorbed its wisdom, ready to apply what we've learned to new problems and new questions as they arise in our intellectual journeys. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Imagine being told something that sounds perfectly simple. You will receive a visit on one of the next 5 weekdays, and when it happens, you will not have known in advance which day it would be. The words themselves carry no mystery. They describe a future event paired with a claim about your own knowledge. Yet when you sit down and try to reason through what those words actually mean, something strange begins to happen. The statement seems to fold in on itself. What looked like a straightforward announcement becomes a puzzle that has occupied philosophers, mathematicians, and logicians for decades. This is the essence of what is often called the surprise examination paradox, though it appears in many forms. The unexpected hanging, the surprise inspection, the unanticipated quiz. The structure remains the same. Someone in authority makes a promise about a future event and adds a condition about surprise or unpredictability. Then someone tries to reason about that promise, and the reasoning leads to a conclusion that seems impossible to reconcile with what actually happens. Let us begin with the most basic version, stripped of all embellishment. A prisoner is informed by a judge that an execution will take place on one weekday during the coming week, Monday through Friday. The prisoner is also told that the execution will be a surprise. What does surprise mean here? It means that on the morning of the execution, the prisoner will not know with certainty that the execution is scheduled for that day. The prisoner will wake up that morning without being able to deduce, based on logic and the information available, that today is the day. This is not about fear or anxiety or wild guessing. It is a precise statement about knowledge and deduction. The prisoner may suspect, may worry, may feel dread, but those are not the same as knowing. The condition of surprise is a condition about logical certainty. If the prisoner can sit down the night before and prove, using only logic and the original announcement, that the execution must occur tomorrow, then tomorrow would not be a surprise. The promise would be broken. This setup seems entirely reasonable. Authorities carry out plans all the time, without revealing exact timing. Military inspections happen without advance notice. Teachers give pop quizzes. Parents plan surprise parties. The idea that something can be scheduled but still unpredictable is woven into ordinary life. So when the judge tells the prisoner that the execution will happen but will also be a surprise, Nothing about the sentence sounds paradoxical at first. It sounds like a straightforward, if grim, piece of information. The prisoner might feel despair or hope or confusion, but there is no obvious logical trap waiting in the words themselves. The paradox only emerges when the prisoner begins to think about what those words actually require. And so the prisoner begins to reason. The execution will happen on one of 5 days: Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday or Friday. It will be a surprise, meaning the prisoner cannot know in advance which day it will be. The prisoner decides to think backward from the end of the week, starting with Friday. Suppose the prisoner thinks that the execution has not happened by Thursday evening. Thursday passes without incident. The prisoner goes to sleep Thursday night, wakes up Friday morning, and realizes something important. There is only 1 day left in the week. The judge promised the execution would happen this week. If it has not happened yet, and only Friday remains, then the execution must happen today. There is no other possibility. The prisoner can deduce with absolute certainty that Friday is the day. But if the prisoner can deduce this, then Friday morning would not be a surprise. The prisoner would know through pure logic that the execution is coming that very day. This contradicts the judge's promise that the execution would be a surprise. Therefore, the prisoner concludes the execution cannot happen on Friday. This reasoning feels solid. It uses only the information given in the original announcement. It makes no wild leaps or strange assumptions. It simply follows the logic of elimination and the definition of surprise. If Friday were the day, the prisoner would know it in advance, so Friday cannot be the day. The prisoner has ruled out one of the 5 possibilities, and this is where the paradox starts to accelerate, because the same reasoning can be applied again. Now suppose the execution has not happened by Wednesday evening. Thursday and Friday are both still ahead, but the prisoner has just proven that Friday is impossible. So if Thursday night arrives and nothing has happened yet, the prisoner will know that Friday is not an option. That leaves only Thursday. By elimination, the execution would have to occur on Thursday. The prisoner would wake up Thursday morning, realize Friday has been ruled out, and deduce with certainty that today is the day. Once again, this would violate the condition of surprise. Thursday morning would not bring uncertainty, it would bring logical certainty. Therefore, the prisoner concludes, the execution cannot happen on Thursday either. The pattern is now visible, and it continues to unfold with mechanical precision. If Friday and Thursday are both impossible, then consider Wednesday. Suppose nothing has happened by Tuesday night. The prisoner knows Friday is impossible, and Thursday is impossible. That leaves only Wednesday, Tuesday and Monday as options. But if Wednesday arrives, the prisoner can eliminate Friday and Thursday from consideration, leaving only Wednesday itself, or the days before it. If the prisoner wakes up Wednesday morning and nothing has happened Monday or Tuesday, then Wednesday becomes deducible. It would not be a surprise, so Wednesday is impossible. Then Tuesday becomes deducible if Monday passes without incident. So Tuesday is impossible. And Monday, if it is the only day left after all others are eliminated, would be deducible from the very start. So Monday is impossible too. Step by step, day by day, the prisoner's reasoning eliminates every option. The backward induction spreads from Friday all the way to Monday. Each day falls to the same argument. If all the later days are impossible, then each remaining day becomes predictable in turn, and therefore cannot satisfy the surprise condition. The conclusion is stark and strange. There is no day on which the execution can occur while still being a surprise. The judge's announcement, taken literally and analysed logically, appears to describe an impossible situation. The prisoner has proven, or seems to have proven, that the execution cannot happen at all. This is a powerful moment in the paradox. The prisoner has used only rational thought, only the tools of logic, to arrive at a conclusion that contradicts the plain meaning of the original statement. The judge said the execution will happen. The prisoner's reasoning says it cannot. One of these must be wrong. And if the prisoner is confident in the reasoning, then the judge's promise must be false or contradictory. The prisoner might feel a strange kind of relief. If the logic is sound, then perhaps the whole thing was a bluff, a mistake, a statement that could not be made true. Perhaps the prisoner will not be executed after all. But then comes the twist, the moment that gives the paradox its bite. On Wednesday morning, the guard arrives. The execution takes place, and the prisoner is completely surprised. Despite the proof, despite the chain of reasoning that eliminated every day, the event occurs, and it catches the prisoner off guard. The prisoner had convinced themselves that the execution could not happen, so when it does happen, it is unexpected. It is, in the most ordinary sense of the word, a surprise. The judge's original promise is fulfilled. The execution happened on a weekday, and the prisoner did not know in advance which day it would be. In fact, the prisoner had concluded it would not happen at all, which made the surprise even more complete. This outcome seems to shatter the prisoner's reasoning. The logic appeared airtight, yet reality unfolded in a way that contradicted the conclusion. The paradox is not just that the reasoning led to a strange result. The paradox is that the reasoning seemed rigorous and correct, yet the world did not cooperate. The execution was both logically impossible, according to the prisoner's proof, and actually real, according to what happened. How can both be true? Where did the reasoning go wrong, or did it go wrong at all? This is the puzzle that has made the surprise examination paradox so enduring and so frustrating. It takes a simple scenario and turns it into a question about the foundations of logic, knowledge, and prediction. To understand where the tension arises, it helps to look more carefully at what surprise actually means in this context. In everyday language, surprise is an emotional reaction. You are surprised when something unexpected happens, when your predictions turn out to be wrong, when the world delivers something you did not anticipate. But the paradox does not rely on emotion. It relies on a logical notion of surprise, defined in terms of what the prisoner can deduce or know with certainty. The announcement says the prisoner will not know in advance which day the execution will occur. This is not about feelings, it is about epistemology, the study of knowledge. The condition is that the prisoner cannot logically derive from the available information which day is the correct one. If the prisoner can derive it, the condition is violated. If the prisoner cannot, the condition is met. This distinction is important because it shifts the paradox from psychology to logic. It is not about whether the prisoner feels surprised. It is about whether the prisoner can construct a valid proof of which day it will be. And this is where the reasoning becomes delicate, because proofs and deductions depend on assumptions. They depend on what the prisoner believes, what the prisoner knows, and how the prisoner updates those beliefs over time. The prisoner's backward reasoning assumes that certain things remain stable, that the original announcement is true, that the prisoner will continue to reason correctly, that the logic will hold at each step. But some of those assumptions may be quietly undermining the very reasoning they support. Consider the first step again, the elimination of Friday. The prisoner says, if the execution has not happened by Thursday night, then I will know on Friday morning that it must happen today, so Friday cannot be a surprise. This seems sound, but notice what it assumes. It assumes that on Friday morning, the prisoner will still believe the original announcement. The prisoner will still believe that the execution is going to happen, and will still believe it must happen this week. If the prisoner reaches Friday morning and has already concluded, through backward reasoning, that the execution cannot happen at all, then the prisoner would not wake up Friday morning thinking, it must be today. The prisoner would wake up thinking, it cannot happen because my reasoning proved it impossible. In that case, Friday would indeed be a surprise because the prisoner would not expect it. This creates a kind of loop. The reasoning that eliminates Friday depends on the prisoner maintaining belief in the announcement. But the reasoning also leads the prisoner to conclude that the announcement cannot be fulfilled. These two things are in tension. If the prisoner fully accepts the conclusion of the backward reasoning, then the prisoner no longer believes the execution will happen, which means the premises of the backward reasoning no longer apply. The argument uses its own conclusion to undermine its own premises. This is a subtle form of self-reference, and self-reference is often where paradoxes are born. Another way to see the problem is to think about the difference between what is true and what the prisoner knows. The judge's announcement is a statement about what will happen and about what the prisoner will know. It says, the execution will occur and you will not know in advance which day. But the prisoner's reasoning tries to figure out what the prisoner will know in the future, based on what the prisoner knows now. This creates a dependency. The prisoner's future knowledge depends on the prisoner's current reasoning. But the current reasoning is trying to predict that future knowledge. The prediction becomes entangled with the thing being predicted. Imagine the prisoner reasoning this way on Monday morning. The prisoner thinks, if I make it to Thursday night, I will know the execution must be Friday, so Friday is impossible. But whether the prisoner actually makes it to Thursday night depends on whether the execution happens before then. And whether the execution happens before then is exactly what the prisoner is trying to figure out. The reasoning is circular in a hidden way. It assumes the prisoner will reach certain points in the week, then uses that assumption to draw conclusions about what must happen, which in turn affects whether those points are actually reached. The logic folds back on itself, and that folding creates instability. Philosophers and logicians have spent a great deal of effort trying to pin down exactly whether reasoning fails, or whether it fails at all. There is no single agreed-upon resolution. Instead, there are several different interpretations, each highlighting a different aspect of the paradox. These interpretations are not necessarily contradictory. They are more like different lenses through which to view the same strange phenomenon. Each lens reveals something important about the relationship between knowledge, time, and self-reference. 1. Interpretation says that the judge's original announcement is simply self-contradictory. According to this view, it is impossible to make a true statement of the form, event X will happen, and you will not be able to deduce when it will happen, even though I am telling you it will happen within a specific range of days. The announcement, when analysed carefully, contains a hidden contradiction. It promises both that something definite will occur and that it will remain unpredictable, but those two promises cannot both be kept under the strict logical conditions the paradox assumes. If the judge truly announces the execution and truly restricts it to 5 specific days, then there are scenarios, like reaching Thursday night, where the prisoner can deduce the day. The announcement tries to rule out those scenarios by saying the execution will be a surprise, but ruling them out is precisely what makes the announcement incoherent. The paradox on this view is not really a paradox, it is just an impossible statement dressed up as a puzzle. The resolution is to recognize that the judge cannot make such an announcement truthfully. Any attempt to do so will lead to contradiction. This interpretation has a certain elegance. It cuts through the confusion by declaring that the setup itself is flawed. There is no need to find a subtle error in the prisoner's reasoning, because the prisoner is reasoning about an impossible premise. Of course, the reasoning leads to strange conclusions. It is trying to make sense of something that does not make sense. The paradox dissolves once you accept that the judge's words cannot be both true and coherent. But this interpretation also feels a bit unsatisfying, because it suggests that the paradox is merely a linguistic trick. It implies that there is nothing deep to learn, only a lesson in being careful about what we promise. And that does not quite match the intuition that something genuinely interesting is happening here, something that touches on real issues in logic and epistemology. A different interpretation focuses on the prisoner's reasoning process rather than the announcement itself. According to this view, the announcement is not necessarily contradictory, but the prisoner's backward induction fails because it makes unjustified assumptions about what the prisoner will know and believe at future points. The prisoner reasons as if knowledge is cumulative and stable, as if reaching Thursday night with no execution automatically means the prisoner will know it must be Friday. But knowledge is not that simple. Knowledge depends on what you believe and what evidence you have, and both of those can change. If the prisoner has already concluded, through backward reasoning, that the execution cannot happen, then reaching Thursday night does not provide new evidence that it must happen Friday. The prisoner's belief state is different from what the backward reasoning assumes. The argument treats future knowledge as if it is independent of the reasoning process, but it is not. The reasoning itself changes what the prisoner believes, which changes what the prisoner can deduce, which invalidates the reasoning. This interpretation highlights a deep issue in using logic to predict one's own future mental states. When you reason about what you will know tomorrow, you are not reasoning about some external fact. You are reasoning about yourself, your own beliefs, your own conclusions, and that reasoning is itself part of the process that determines what you will believe. The prisoner's argument assumes a kind of separation between the reasoning now and the knowledge later, but that separation does not exist. The reasoning now is shaping the knowledge later, so the reasoning cannot treat the knowledge as a fixed external fact to be discovered. This is similar to other paradoxes involving self-reference, like the liar paradox, where a statement refers to its own truth value and creates a loop. Here the prisoner's reasoning refers to the prisoner's own future conclusions, creating a similar kind of loop. Yet another way to dissolve the paradox is to question whether surprise really means what the paradox assumes it means. In the formal version of the paradox, surprise is defined as the absence of certainty. The prisoner is surprised if, and only if, the prisoner cannot deduce the day in advance. But in ordinary life, surprise is more flexible. You can be surprised by something even if you could have predicted it. You can be surprised by something even if, in hindsight, all the clues were there. Surprise is about actual expectations, not just theoretical deducibility. If the prisoner spends the whole week convinced that the execution will not happen because the backward reasoning proved it impossible, then when the execution does happen, the prisoner is genuinely surprised. The prisoner's actual expectation was that nothing would occur. The fact that the prisoner could have, in principle, deduced the day under different assumptions is not relevant to whether the prisoner was actually surprised. This interpretation suggests that the paradox arises from conflating two different notions of surprise. There is logical surprise, defined in terms of what can be proven, and there is psychological surprise, defined in terms of what someone actually expects. The judge's announcement, in ordinary language, is probably about psychological surprise. The judge is saying the prisoner will not expect the execution on the day it happens, but the prisoner's reasoning interprets the announcement as being about logical surprise, about what can be deduced. These are not the same thing, and the paradox exploits the gap between them. Once you recognize that gap, the paradox loses some of its force. The execution can be logically deducible in certain scenarios and still be psychologically surprising, because the prisoner's actual mental state does not align with what the formal logic says is deducible. Each of these interpretations offers a way to relieve the tension, but none of them fully captures the strangeness of the experience of working through the paradox. There is something genuinely puzzling about the fact that the prisoner's reasoning seems so convincing, step by step, and yet leads to a conclusion that is contradicted by events. It feels like the reasoning should work. It feels like you should be able to use logic to figure out what will happen. But the paradox shows that there are limits to what reasoning can do, especially when reasoning tries to predict its own future conclusions, or when it involves statements about knowledge and belief. The paradox also reveals something important about the structure of time and prediction. Most logical reasoning is timeless. If A implies B, then that implication holds regardless of when you discover it. But the surprise examination paradox is fundamentally about time. It is about what you can know now versus what you will know later. It is about how information accumulates as time passes and how that accumulation changes what can be deduced. The prisoner's reasoning tries to collapse time, to figure out everything in advance, but time resists that collapse. The passage of time brings new information, and that new information changes the logical landscape. What was deducible on Monday may not be deducible on Wednesday, not because the facts changed, but because what the prisoner knows and believes has changed. This connects to broader questions in epistemology about the nature of knowledge and belief. Knowledge is often defined as justified true belief. You know something if you believe it, it is true, and you have good reasons to believe it. But the surprise examination paradox challenges this neat definition. The prisoner believes, with apparent justification, that the execution cannot happen. The prisoner has reasoned through the possibilities and found them all wanting. That belief is justified by the backward induction argument, but the belief is false because the execution does happen. So the prisoner has justified false belief. Does that mean the justification was flawed? Or does it mean that justification is not always enough? The paradox does not provide clear answers, but it raises the questions in a vivid and unavoidable way. There is also a connection to game theory and strategic reasoning. In game theory, players often reason about what other players will do, and those other players are also reasoning about what the first player will do. This creates layers of reasoning. I think that you think that I think. The surprise examination paradox involves a similar kind of layered reasoning, except here the prisoner is reasoning about their own future self. The prisoner is trying to predict what the prisoner will know and believe later, and using that prediction to draw conclusions now. But the prisoner's future self is not an independent player. The future self is shaped by the reasoning happening now. This creates a kind of strategic loop where the reasoning influences its own outcome, and that influence makes the reasoning unstable. One of the most intriguing aspects of the paradox is how robust it is to variations. You can change the scenario in many ways, and the paradox persists. Instead of an execution, imagine a teacher announcing a surprise quiz. Instead of a prisoner, imagine a student trying to figure out when the quiz will be. The backward reasoning unfolds in exactly the same way. The student reasons that the quiz cannot be on the last day of the period, because that would be predictable, and then eliminates each earlier day in turn, concluding the quiz is impossible. Then the teacher gives the quiz, and the student is surprised. The paradox does not depend on the grim details of execution. It works with any scenario where someone in authority schedules an event within a known range and adds the condition that it will be unpredictable. You can also change the number of days. Suppose the judge says the execution will happen within 2 days, Monday or Tuesday. The prisoner reasons, if Monday passes, it must be Tuesday. So Tuesday is not a surprise, so it cannot be Tuesday. Then it must be Monday. But if it must be Monday, then Monday is not a surprise either. So the execution cannot happen at all. Yet, it can happen on Monday and be a surprise, because the prisoner convinced themselves it could not happen. The paradox works even with just 2 options. In fact, it works with any finite number of options greater than 1. The backward reasoning always finds a way to eliminate every possibility, and yet the event can still occur and still be surprising. Some versions of the paradox involve not days, but other units of time or other forms of discretization. Instead of weekdays, imagine a prisoner told the execution will happen during one of 5 specific hours, and they will not know in advance which hour. The reasoning proceeds in the same way, eliminating the last hour, then the second to last, and so on. Or imagine a sequence of rooms instead of a sequence of days. A person is told they will find a prize in one of 5 rooms, but they will not know in advance which one. They reason backward from the 5th room, eliminating each room in turn. The paradox adapts to all these variations because its core is not about execution, or days or rooms. Its core is about the interaction between a prediction, a condition about knowledge, and the self-referential nature of reasoning about one's own future beliefs. There is even a version of the paradox that removes the authority figure entirely. Suppose a person simply believes, for whatever reason, that something will happen to them in the next 5 days, and it will happen on a day they do not expect. They try to reason about when it will be and reach the same contradictory conclusion. The paradox does not strictly require an announcement from someone else. It can arise from any situation where someone tries to predict an event under a constraint about their own knowledge of the prediction. This makes the paradox even more unsettling because it suggests the problem is not about communication or promises. It is about the structure of self-referential reasoning itself. Philosophers have connected the surprise examination paradox to other famous problems in logic and philosophy. It shares structure with the liar paradox, where a statement says of itself that it is false, creating an unresolvable loop. It relates to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that any sufficiently rich logical system contains statements that cannot be proved or disproved within the system. It touches on issues in modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity, because the paradox involves reasoning about what must be true versus what might be true. It connects to epistemic logic, the logic of knowledge, because the whole puzzle is about what the prisoner knows or can deduce. In all these areas, the paradox serves as a concrete example of how reasoning about knowledge, truth, and self-reference can lead to unexpected difficulties. The paradox also has implications for practical reasoning and decision-making. In real life, we often try to predict what will happen based on what we know now. We make plans, anticipate events, prepare for contingencies. The surprise examination paradox suggests there are limits to this kind of anticipation, especially when the events we are trying to predict depend on our own beliefs and reactions. If a military commander announces a surprise inspection, the announcement itself changes the behaviour of the troops, which might change when the inspection can effectively be a surprise. If a regulator announces a surprise audit, companies might alter their behaviour in ways that interact with the timing of the audit. The interplay between the announcement and the response is not simple, and the paradox captures some of that complexity in a stylised form. There is also a question about rationality. Is the prisoner reasoning rationally when they perform the backward induction? Each step seems rational. It seems rational to conclude that if only one day remains, the execution must be that day. It seems rational to conclude that if a day can be deduced in advance, it does not meet the surprise condition. It seems rational to apply this reasoning repeatedly. Yet the conclusion is that the execution cannot happen, which is contradicted by events. Does this mean the prisoner is being irrational, or does it mean that rationality has limits? Some philosophers argue that the prisoner's reasoning is rational but unsound, meaning the steps are logical, but one of the premises is false. Others argue that the reasoning is sound but not applicable, meaning it is correct in an abstract sense but fails when applied to a real scenario involving time and belief. Still others argue that the reasoning reveals a genuine inconsistency in the concept of a surprise execution, showing that the concept itself is problematic. One subtle point is the difference between reasoning about possibilities and reasoning about certainties. When the prisoner eliminates Friday, the reasoning is about what would be certain if the prisoner reached Thursday night. But whether the prisoner reaches Thursday night is not certain. It is a conditional. The prisoner is saying, if I reach Thursday night, then Friday is not a surprise, so the judge cannot plan Friday. But this assumes the judge is trying to satisfy the surprise condition under all possible circumstances. Maybe the judge is only trying to satisfy it in the actual circumstances that will occur. If the judge plans to execute the prisoner on Wednesday, then whether Friday would be a surprise is irrelevant, because Friday will never arrive. The prisoner's reasoning considers all possible futures, but only one future will actually happen, and the judge's plan only needs to work in that one future. This opens up another interpretation. Maybe the judge's announcement is true, and the execution will be a surprise, but the prisoner's reasoning fails because it considers counterfactual scenarios that will not occur. The prisoner reasons about what would happen on Friday, but if the execution is on Wednesday, then Friday is a hypothetical, not a reality. The prisoner's conclusion that Friday is impossible is based on a hypothetical scenario, and applying that conclusion to rule out Friday in the actual world is a mistake. The reasoning conflates what would be true in a hypothetical with what is true in reality. This is a subtle error, but it might be the key to understanding why the reasoning goes wrong. Yet even this interpretation does not fully resolve the paradox, because the prisoner's reasoning on Monday does not know which day will actually occur. The whole point of the reasoning is to figure that out. The prisoner has to consider all possible days and ask whether each one is consistent with being a surprise. The prisoner cannot assume in advance that Wednesday is the actual day, and therefore ignore the reasoning about Friday. The reasoning has to work across all possibilities, and that is where the trouble starts. The attempt to reason across all possibilities leads to the conclusion that no possibility works, but that conclusion is contradicted by the fact that one possibility does work in practice. Another angle is to think about common knowledge, a concept from game theory and epistemic logic. Common knowledge means not only that everyone knows something, but that everyone knows that everyone knows it, and everyone knows that everyone knows that everyone knows it, and so on, infinitely. Some analyses of the paradox suggest that the judge's announcement does not create common knowledge of the surprise condition in the right way. The judge knows the plan, the prisoner knows the announcement. But does the prisoner know that the judge knows that the prisoner knows the announcement? And does the judge account for the prisoner's reasoning in making the plan? If the layers of knowledge are not perfectly aligned, the reasoning might break down. The prisoner's backward induction assumes a certain structure of mutual knowledge, and if that structure is not actually in place, the reasoning does not go through. This is getting at a very abstract level, but it points to something important. The paradox is not just about logic in a vacuum. It is about logic applied to a situation involving two agents, a judge and a prisoner, who have different information and different perspectives. The prisoner is trying to deduce the judge's plan, but the judge's plan might take into account the prisoner's reasoning. This creates a feedback loop, where each agent's reasoning depends on the others, and that feedback might destabilize the whole setup. In a sense, the paradox is about the impossibility of one rational agent perfectly predicting another rational agent's plan when that plan is designed to be unpredictable to the first agent. It is worth pausing to consider how the paradox feels from the prisoner's perspective, even though this is a thought experiment and not a real scenario. The prisoner starts with a piece of information that seems to offer a glimmer of hope, or at least understanding. The judge has announced the execution will happen, but the prisoner thinks, perhaps I can figure out when, and knowing when might give me some control, or at least some certainty. The prisoner sits down to reason, step by step, and the reasoning seems to work. Each day is eliminated in turn. The conclusion is that the execution cannot happen. For a moment, the prisoner might feel relief or vindication. The logic is on my side. The judge has made a mistake or a bluff. I am safe. But then reality intervenes. The execution happens. The logic did not protect the prisoner. The reasoning did not reveal a flaw in the judge's plan. Instead, the reasoning created a false sense of certainty, and that false certainty made the actual event even more surprising. This emotional arc, from hope to certainty to shock, mirrors the logical arc of the paradox, from premise to deduction to contradiction. From the judge's perspective, if we imagine the judge as aware of the paradox, the situation is different. The judge knows that announcing a surprise execution might lead the prisoner to reason backward and conclude it cannot happen. The judge also knows that this conclusion is false, because the judge has a specific day in mind and will carry it out. The judge might even be relying on the prisoner's reasoning to ensure the surprise. By announcing the execution and the surprise condition, the judge sets up a situation where the prisoner's own logic leads the prisoner astray. The prisoner's rationality becomes a tool for the judge's purpose. This adds a layer of irony to the paradox. The more rational the prisoner tries to be, the more thoroughly the prisoner is deceived. But this irony depends on the judge being outside the paradox, immune to the reasoning that traps the prisoner. In reality, the paradox applies to anyone trying to reason about it, judge or prisoner, teacher or student. The paradox is not about deception or cleverness. It is about the structure of the problem itself. Anyone who takes the surprise condition seriously and tries to reason about it rigorously will encounter the same difficulties. The paradox is a feature of the logical landscape, not a trick played by one person on another. Let us return to the idea of surprise as a logical condition versus a psychological state. In formal terms, surprise is often modelled as the absence of knowledge. If you know something will happen, you are not surprised when it happens. If you do not know it will happen, you're surprised. But knowledge in logic is usually treated as satisfying certain axioms. Knowledge is true. If you know something, it is true. Knowledge is introspective. If you know something, you know that you know it. Knowledge is consistent. You cannot know contradictory things. These axioms create a structure that is clean and mathematically tractable, but it might not match the messiness of real belief and expectation. Real people have partial beliefs, uncertain expectations, contradictory intuitions. Real people can think they know something and be wrong. Real people can be surprised by things they should have anticipated and unsurprised by things they could not have predicted. The formal notion of knowledge used in the paradox is an idealization, and the paradox might be revealing the limits of that idealization. If we relax the formal definition of knowledge and allow for more realistic models of belief, the paradox might soften. Instead of saying the prisoner knows the execution must be Friday if it has not happened by Thursday, we might say the prisoner has a very strong belief, a high degree of confidence, but not absolute certainty. And strong belief is not the same as knowledge. The prisoner might be 99% sure, but that 1% of doubt is enough to preserve the possibility of surprise. This probabilistic approach changes the character of the reasoning. Instead of eliminating days with certainty, the prisoner updates probabilities. Each day that passes without an execution shifts the probabilities for the remaining days, but no day is ever reduced to zero probability until it actually happens or does not happen. This way of thinking dissolves the paradox by avoiding the absolute certainties that the backward reasoning relies on. However, the probabilistic approach has its own challenges. If the prisoner assigns probabilities to each day, what should those probabilities be? If the judge is choosing uniformly at random, then initially each day has a 20% chance. But the judge's announcement includes the condition of surprise, which is not a random condition. The judge is not just picking a day at random, the judge is picking a day that will be a surprise. How do you assign probabilities to an event defined by a condition about your own knowledge? The probabilities depend on what you expect, but what you expect depends on the probabilities. This is another loop, and it shows that even the probabilistic approach does not entirely escape the self-referential difficulties at the heart of the paradox. There are also game-theoretic models of the paradox that treat it as a strategic interaction. The judge chooses a day, trying to maximize the surprise, and the prisoner forms beliefs, trying to predict the day. The judge's choice depends on what the judge thinks the prisoner believes, and the prisoner's beliefs depend on what the prisoner thinks the judge will choose. This is a classic game theoretic setup, and it can be analysed using concepts like Nash equilibrium in some models. There is no equilibrium where the judge can guarantee surprise for all days, which reflects the paradoxical conclusion that the announcement might be impossible to fulfill. In other models, mixed strategies or randomness allow for an equilibrium where the prisoner is genuinely uncertain. These models provide mathematical precision, but they also show that the paradox is not just a logic puzzle. It is a question about strategic reasoning and the limits of prediction in interactive settings. The surprise examination paradox also appears in the philosophy of science, particularly in discussions of prediction and explanation. Scientific theories make predictions, and those predictions are tested against observations. But what if a theory predicts its own unpredictability? What if a theory says that a certain event will occur but will not be predictable in advance? This sounds paradoxical, similar to the judge's announcement. Yet in some areas of science, such as chaos theory and quantum mechanics, unpredictability is a fundamental feature. Chaos theory shows that even deterministic systems can be unpredictable in practice because of sensitivity to initial conditions. Quantum mechanics includes fundamental randomness in certain measurements. These theories predict that certain outcomes are unpredictable, and they do so successfully. The surprise examination paradox raises the question, how is that possible? How can a theory predict unpredictability without contradiction? The answer seems to be that there is a difference between predicting that something is unpredictable in principle and predicting what that something is. The judge's announcement seems to do both. It predicts the execution will happen and also predicts the prisoner will not know when. But a scientific theory might predict that a quantum measurement will have a random outcome without predicting which outcome. The theory predicts the randomness, not the result. This distinction might be relevant to the paradox if the judge only announced that the execution would be unpredictable, without also announcing that it would definitely happen within a specific range of days. There might be no paradox. The trouble comes from combining the definite promise with the unpredictability condition. The range of days makes the event constrained enough that backward reasoning can get traction, but the unpredictability condition makes it impossible for that reasoning to complete successfully. One of the enduring questions about the paradox is whether it is a problem for logic or a problem for language. Is the paradox showing that formal logic breaks down in certain scenarios? Or is it showing that natural language is ambiguous and can create the appearance of contradiction where there is none? Formal logic is built on precise definitions and strict rules of inference. Natural language is flexible, context-dependent, and often vague. The judge's announcement uses natural language. You will be executed on one weekday, and it will be a surprise. When we try to formalize this in logic, we have to make choices about what surprise means, what no means, how time is modeled, and so on. Different choices lead to different formal statements, and some of those statements might be contradictory, while others are not. The paradox might be an artifact of how we translate the natural language announcement into formal terms. But even if the paradox is partly about translation, it is not just a linguistic quibble. The paradox captures something real about the difficulty of making promises about future knowledge. In everyday life, we make such promises all the time. I'll surprise you with a gift. The test will be unannounced. The inspection will be random. We usually do not run into contradictions because we do not push the logic to its limits. We accept a degree of vagueness and ambiguity. We understand that surprise is not an absolute condition, but a reasonable expectation. But the paradox asks what happens when we try to be rigorous, when we take the words literally and apply strict logical reasoning. The answer is that rigor leads to trouble. The more carefully you analyse the announcement, the more contradictory it seems. This suggests that some ordinary concepts, like surprise, resist formalisation. They work well in practice, but do not fit neatly into the framework of classical logic. There is also a temporal dimension to the paradox that is worth exploring more carefully. The prisoner's reasoning happens at the beginning of the week, before any days have passed. The prisoner is trying to reason about future knowledge, about what will be known on Tuesday, or Thursday, or Friday. But the prisoner's reasoning itself is happening in the present. The prisoner is in a specific moment in time, with a specific set of beliefs and information. As time passes and days go by, the prisoner's situation changes. New information arrives, or fails to arrive, each morning. The prisoner wakes up and learns whether the execution is today or not. This flow of information over time is essential to the scenario, but the backward reasoning tries to collapse it all into a single static argument. The reasoning treats all the days as if they can be analysed at once, in a timeless way. But time does not work like that. Time unfolds step by step, and each step brings new evidence and new context. This mismatch between timeless reasoning and temporal unfolding is a source of the paradox. The backward induction argument is valid in a timeless logical system, where you can consider all possible states and eliminate inconsistencies. But the actual scenario involves time, change, and the accumulation of knowledge. The prisoner cannot actually be in all the future states at once. The prisoner can only imagine them, reason about them hypothetically. And reasoning about hypothetical future states is different from reasoning within those states. When the prisoner reasons on Monday about what would be known on Friday, the prisoner is not actually on Friday. The reasoning is abstract, removed from the actual temporal flow. When Friday arrives, if it arrives, the prisoner is no longer in the abstract reasoning mode. The prisoner is living through the moment with all the beliefs and uncertainties that come from having reasoned through the week. Those beliefs might not match what the timeless reasoning predicted. Some logicians have tried to model the paradox using temporal logic, which includes operators for reasoning about time. Temporal logic can express statements like, it will be the case that X, or it was the case that Y or X holds until Y happens. Using temporal logic, you can try to formalize the judge's announcement more carefully, distinguishing between what is true at different times and what is known at different times. These formal models sometimes reveal hidden assumptions in the informal reasoning, or they show that the announcement cannot be formalized without introducing modal operators that interact in complex ways. The technical details can be intricate, but the upshot is that temporal reasoning about knowledge is subtle, and the paradox exposes some of that subtlety. Another connection is to the philosophy of free will and determinism. If the judge has decided in advance which day the execution will be, then the day is already determined. The prisoner's reasoning does not change that determination. The execution will happen on the day the judge chose, regardless of what the prisoner concludes. Yet the prisoner's reasoning seems to suggest that the prisoner's own logic constrains what the judge can choose. The prisoner concludes that no day is possible, which seems to imply that the judge cannot have made a valid choice. This creates a tension between the determinacy of the judge's decision and the prisoner's reasoning about possibilities. It is reminiscent of debates about whether the future is fixed or open, whether our choices are determined or free. The paradox does not resolve those debates, but it illustrates how reasoning about future events can feel like it constrains those events, even when logically it does not. There is also a playful side to the paradox, a sense in which it is a kind of intellectual game. Presenting the paradox to someone for the first time and watching them work through the reasoning is a common exercise in philosophy classes. People often have strong reactions. Some immediately see the flaw and point it out. Others are convinced by the backward reasoning and insist the execution cannot happen. Still others are puzzled and uncertain. sensing that something is wrong but unable to pinpoint it. The variety of reactions shows that the paradox touches on deep intuitions about reasoning, knowledge, and prediction, intuitions that differ from person to person. It is a test case for how people think about self-reference and time and certainty. The paradox has also inspired variations and extensions in the literature. One famous extension is the unexpected hanging paradox, which is essentially the same as the surprise execution, but framed as a judge telling a prisoner that they will be hanged on a day they do not expect. Another version is the surprise test paradox, where a teacher tells students there will be a test they do not expect. There are versions involving multiple prisoners, or multiple tests, or more complex conditions. Each variation explores a slightly different aspect of the underlying structure. Some versions add complications, like allowing the prisoner to communicate with the judge, or changing the number of days, or introducing uncertainty about the judge's honesty. These variations show that the core paradox is robust and adaptable, a kind of template that can be applied in many contexts. One particularly interesting variation asks what happens if the prisoner is told the execution will happen, but instead of being told it will be a surprise, the prisoner is told it will happen on a day the prisoner expects. This inverts the condition. Now the prisoner tries to figure out which day they expect, and the reasoning becomes a different kind of loop. If the prisoner expects Monday, then the judge might choose Monday, but then the prisoner would expect Monday, so it would not be unexpected, which contradicts the new condition. This inverted version also leads to paradox, showing that the problem is not specifically about surprise, but about any condition that ties the event to the prisoner's expectations or knowledge. The surprise examination paradox also connects to puzzles in probability theory, such as the two-envelope problem or the Sleeping Beauty problem. These puzzles involve reasoning about uncertain events and updating beliefs in the face of new information. They often include elements of self-reference or perspective that make the correct answer unclear. The surprise examination paradox shares this feature. It is not just a logic puzzle, it is a puzzle about how to reason when your own reasoning process is part of the scenario. This makes it harder to step outside the puzzle and see it objectively. You are inside the puzzle, and the puzzle is about you. In educational settings, the paradox is often used to teach students about the limits of logical reasoning and the importance of careful analysis. It shows that intuitive reasoning can go wrong in subtle ways, that each step of an argument can seem sound while the conclusion is false, and that formal rigor sometimes reveals problems that informal reasoning misses. It also teaches students to question assumptions, to look for hidden premises, and to recognize self-reference. These are valuable skills in philosophy, mathematics, computer science, and many other fields. The paradox is a compact, memorable example that illustrates these lessons vividly. There is also a meta level to the paradox, a sense in which discussing the paradox is itself part of the phenomenon. When we talk about the surprise examination paradox, we are reasoning about reasoning. We are analysing the prisoner's analysis. We are thinking about thinking. This meta-level reasoning is common in philosophy and logic, but it can be disorienting. It is easy to lose track of which level you are on, whether you're talking about the prisoner's beliefs or your own beliefs about the prisoner's beliefs. The paradox plays with these levels, and part of its difficulty is keeping them straight. As we approach the end of this exploration, it is worth returning to the original scenario and considering it one more time with fresh eyes. A prisoner is told an execution will happen on one weekday and will be a surprise. The prisoner reasons that no day can satisfy both conditions, so the execution cannot happen. Then the execution happens, and the prisoner is surprised. What is the lesson? The lesson is not that logic is useless or that reasoning leads us astray. The lesson is that logic has limits, especially when it tries to encompass its own application. When reasoning becomes self-referential, when it tries to predict its own conclusions, it can become unstable. The prisoner's reasoning is correct in a narrow, abstract sense, but it fails to account for how the reasoning itself changes the situation. The prisoner assumes a static model of knowledge, where what will be known in the future is independent of what is concluded now. But knowledge is dynamic. It evolves with time and evidence and thought. The reasoning that eliminates Friday on Monday is not the same as the reasoning that would occur on Friday, because by Friday, the prisoner's beliefs have changed. The judge's announcement, meanwhile, is not a formal logical statement. It is a practical promise made in natural language about a future event. The judge is not claiming to satisfy a set of logical axioms. The judge is claiming to carry out an execution in a way that the prisoner will not expect, and that practical claim can be fulfilled even if a formal logical analysis finds contradictions. The gap between formal logic and practical reality is real, and the paradox lives in that gap. Formal logic offers precision and rigour, but it cannot always capture the full complexity of time, belief, and action. Practical reality is messy, context-dependent, and often ambiguous, but it can accommodate outcomes that formal logic struggles to model. This does not mean we should abandon logic or embrace contradiction. It means we should be aware of the limits of formalization. Logic is a powerful tool, but it is not the only tool, and it is not always the right tool for every question. The surprise examination paradox reminds us to think carefully about what we are modelling, what assumptions we are making, and whether the formal structure we are using actually matches the informal scenario we are analysing. It reminds us to be humble about the reach of pure reason, to recognise that reasoning about ourselves and our own future knowledge is different from reasoning about external facts. It reminds us that surprise, expectation, and knowledge are subtle concepts that resist reduction to simple, formal definitions. In the end, the paradox is a gift to anyone interested in thinking clearly. It is a small, simple scenario that opens up into a vast landscape of questions about logic, language, time, belief, and self-reference. It has no single correct answer, no final resolution that everyone agrees on. Instead, it offers a space for exploration, for different perspectives and different insights. It shows that even the most basic-sounding statements can hide deep complexities. It invites us to think harder, to question our assumptions, to test our intuitions. And it does all this with a kind of elegant simplicity, a setup that can be explained in a few sentences, but can occupy a mind for hours, days, or years. The prisoner, sitting in a cell, trying to reason about an execution that will be a surprise, is all of us trying to predict the unpredictable, trying to know the unknowable, trying to use logic to escape uncertainty. The fact that the reasoning leads to paradox is not a failure. It is a discovery. It is the discovery that some things cannot be fully captured by reasoning, that some uncertainties cannot be eliminated, that some surprises cannot be avoided. The prisoner's effort to eliminate surprise through logic is admirable, but doomed. The future remains open, unknown, surprising, no matter how much we reason about it. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the paradox. Not that logic fails, but that some aspects of experience like surprise exist precisely because they cannot be fully predicted or controlled. They exist in the gap between what we can reason about and what actually happens, and that gap is not a flaw in our thinking. It is a feature of the world. The paradox teaches us to be comfortable with that gap, to accept that reasoning has limits, to embrace the uncertainty that remains after all the arguments have been made. It teaches us that being surprised is not a sign of irrationality or ignorance. It is a sign of being embedded in time, of living through events as they unfold, of having beliefs that change and grow. The prisoner who is surprised by the execution is not making a mistake. The prisoner is experiencing what it means to be a finite temporal being, trying to navigate a world that is richer and stranger than any formal system can capture. And so, the paradox, despite its austere logical structure, is ultimately about something very human: the experience of not knowing, the hope of understanding, and the inevitable surprise that life brings. It is about the distance between the map and the territory, the plan and the event, the reasoning and the outcome. It is about the quiet humility that comes from recognizing that no matter how carefully we think, no matter how rigorously we reason, the future will always hold something we did not expect. The execution happens, and it is a surprise, not because the prisoner failed to think hard enough, but because surprise is woven into the fabric of prediction and time. The paradox does not solve this mystery. It simply points to it, clearly and precisely, and invites us to think about what it means to reason about our own future knowledge in a world where that knowledge is always, inevitably, incomplete. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.